Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I've been running long-haul routes for 17 years now, and I've learned that the road has its own language. It speaks in the hum of tires on asphalt, in the rhythm of mile markers flashing past in the dark, in the way headlights cut through fog like knives through something solid. Most drivers learn to read that language early, or they don't last. But sometimes, just sometimes, the road says something you don't want to hear. And when that happens, you either listen or you pay the price. This particular run started like 1,000 others. I'd picked up a load of industrial parts in Reno, bound for a distribution center outside Bakersfield. A standard westbound haul across the state line, the kind of route I could drive in my sleep. It was late October, and the desert nights were getting cold. That sharp, dry cold that makes your breath visible even inside the cab. The forecast called for clear skies. No wind to speak of. Just that endless stretch of emptiness that makes up most of the Nevada-California border. Perfect conditions, or so I thought. I left Reno just after 8 in the evening, which put me crossing the state line somewhere around 11:30. That's when I like to drive, when the highway empties out and it's just you and the road and whatever thoughts you brought along for company. The radio was playing some old country station out of Sparks. Merle Haggard singing about silver wings and broken hearts, and I remember thinking how perfectly that kind of music fit the landscape. Nothing but sagebrush and darkness stretching out in every direction, the occasional pair of taillights way up ahead, disappearing around curves you couldn't quite see yet. The CB had been quiet most of the night. A few scattered conversations between drivers heading east, somebody complaining about construction backup near Winnemucca, but nothing worth joining in on. I kept it on channel 19 out of habit, the static buzz providing a kind of white noise that filled the spaces between songs. My name's Roy Tanner, and I've learned over the years that the CB is more than just communication. It's a lifeline. A way to stay connected to other people doing the exact same thing you're doing, fighting the same loneliness, covering the same miles. Even when nobody's talking, just knowing it's there makes the night feel a little less empty. I crossed into California around 11:45, the state line marked by nothing more than a faded sign half buried in tumbleweeds. The highway stretched ahead like a ribbon of darker darkness, cutting through the desert with the kind of geometric precision that makes you forget you're in the natural world. Out here, everything feels artificial, like someone drew the road with a ruler and forgot to add any of the details that make a place feel real. No trees, no buildings, just mile markers and the occasional reflector post catching your headlights. That's when I first noticed the overpass. It appeared maybe 2 miles ahead, visible only because of my high beams picking out the concrete support pillars. Nothing unusual about it. Overpasses are common enough even out here, carrying frontage roads or old ranch access routes over the highway. But something about this one caught my attention. Maybe it was the way it sat alone in all that emptiness, no other structures visible for miles. Maybe it was the way the shadows pooled underneath it, darker than they should have been given the clear sky and bright stars. Or maybe it was just the timing, the way it appeared right as Merle Haggard's voice faded out and the radio filled with static. I glanced at the clock on my dash. 11:47 p.m. The numbers glowed green in the darkness, and I remember thinking how precise they looked, how certain. Time always feels more solid when you're driving at night, each minute clicking by with mechanical regularity, marking your progress across the map. I was making good time, ahead of schedule by almost an hour, which meant I could afford to take it easy, maybe pull into a rest area for coffee if I needed it. The overpass grew larger as I approached, its concrete bulk blocking out a section of stars. It was a simple structure, nothing fancy, just two thick support pillars holding up a single span of roadway, maybe 30 feet above the highway. The kind of thing you pass under without thinking, barely registering its existence. But as my headlights swept across it, I saw something that made me ease off the accelerator just slightly. The shadows underneath weren't uniform. There was a shape there, a darker patch of darkness that didn't quite match the geometry of the structure. It hung at an odd angle, suspended between the support pillars, and for just a second, my brain tried to make sense of it. A tarp, maybe, or debris caught on something. But it moved slightly, swaying in a wind I couldn't feel, and that's when my hands tightened on the steering wheel. I passed under the overpass doing about 65, my eyes locked on the rearview mirror, watching that strange shadow recede into the distance. The moment I cleared it, the radio snapped back to clarity, Merle Haggard's voice returning mid-verse like nothing had happened. But something had happened. I could feel it in my chest. That tight, compressed feeling you get when your instincts are screaming at you but your rational mind hasn't caught up yet. I checked the mirrors again, but the overpass was already fading into the darkness behind me. Just another anonymous structure on an anonymous stretch of highway. The CB crackled then, just once. A brief burst of static that resolved into silence. I turned up the volume slightly, listening for voices, for anything that might explain the sudden interference. Nothing, just the endless hiss of empty airwaves. I kept driving, telling myself it was nothing, just a dead zone in the radio coverage, just my imagination filling in the blanks. But my jaw was clenched, and I couldn't seem to relax my grip on the wheel. Mile marker 47 slid past on my right, the reflective numbers catching my lights. Then marker 48. The road curved slightly to the southwest, following the contours of a dry wash I couldn't see in the darkness. I settled back into my rhythm, trying to recapture that peaceful feeling I'd had before the overpass. The dashboard lights cast a soft glow over the interior of the cab, illuminating the coffee thermos wedged into the cup holder, the logbook folded open on the passenger seat, all the familiar details of my mobile office. This was my space, my domain, and out here I was in control. Or at least that's what I told myself. At 2:47 a.m., the CB exploded with static. Not gradually, not a slow build, just instant maximum volume white noise that made me jump hard enough to swerve slightly into the left lane. I grabbed the volume knob and twisted it down, my heart hammering, adrenaline dumping into my system. The static cut off as suddenly as it had started, leaving behind a ringing silence that felt somehow worse. I stared at the CB unit, watching the channel indicator, waiting for it to happen again. The green LED display showed channel 19, same as always, but the squelch light was flickering erratically, like it was picking up something just below the threshold of audibility. I checked the clock. 2:47 a.m. exactly. The numbers glowed with that same green certainty, and I felt something cold settle into my stomach. I looked ahead at the road, and there it was again, maybe a mile distant. That same overpass rising out of the darkness like a monument to nothing. The same concrete pillars, the same span of elevated roadway, the same pooling shadows underneath. Impossible. I'd passed it hours ago, put at least 100 miles between me and that structure. But there was no mistaking it. The shape was identical, the placement was identical, even that strange hanging shadow was there. Suspended in the space between the supports, I checked my GPS unit. The little screen mounted on the dash showing my position as a blue dot crawling along a red line. According to it, I was exactly where I should be. Still westbound on the highway, still making steady progress toward California. But the overpass ahead told a different story. I eased off the accelerator, letting my speed drop to 50, then 45, my eyes moving between the road and the structure growing larger in my windshield. Maybe it was a different overpass. Maybe I was misremembering. Maybe the isolation and the late hour were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew. I'd seen enough roads, passed under enough bridges to know when something was wrong. The CB crackled again, softer this time, and through the static I thought I heard something. Not words exactly, more like the shape of words, the suggestion of a voice trying to push through interference. I grabbed the mic, keying it twice. "Breaker 19, I said, my voice sounding strange and small in the cab. "Anyone out there read me?" Nothing but static in response, that same shapeless hiss. I tried again. "This is westbound at mile marker." I glanced at the last marker I'd passed. Mile marker 73. Anyone got a copy? Still nothing. I passed under the overpass, doing 40. This time I watched the shadow more carefully, and what I saw made my breath catch. It wasn't debris. It wasn't a tarp. It was the absence of something. A hollow space where even the ambient starlight didn't penetrate, and it moved independent of any wind. As my headlights swept across the underside of the structure, the shadow seemed to shift, pulling back into itself, retreating into the angles between concrete and darkness. And then I was through, back into open highway, and the radio snapped back to normal with an old Waylon Jennings song already in progress. I drove faster after that, pushing the speed up to 70, then 75. The road ahead was empty, no other vehicles visible, just that endless stripe of asphalt cutting through the desert. My hands were shaking on the wheel, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, in through the nose, out through the mouth, trying to calm the panic rising in my chest. It was just an overpass, just a structure. I'd passed under thousands of them. There was nothing unusual about it except my own reaction, my own tired mind making connections that weren't there. But at 2:47 a.m. the next night, when I was 200 miles north on a completely different highway, the CB filled with static again. Same time, same intensity. And when I looked up at the road ahead, I saw it. That overpass, rising out of the darkness like it had been waiting for me, like it knew I was coming. And in the space underneath, between those concrete pillars, that shadow hung suspended, watching, waiting, and I understood with terrible clarity that distance didn't matter. The overpass wasn't following me. I was following it. Or maybe we were following each other, locked in some pattern I didn't understand, bound together by something that had started the moment I first passed beneath it. I didn't stop driving that night. Couldn't. Every time I thought about pulling over, about taking a break at one of the rest areas that dotted the highway, I'd imagine that overpass appearing in my mirrors, imagine what might be waiting for me in the shadows underneath. So I kept moving, kept my speed steady, kept the CB volume low enough that I couldn't hear the static when 247 rolled around again. But I could see the squelch light flickering, could feel the interference even if I couldn't hear it, and that was almost worse. 3 days after that first encounter, I found myself approaching the Nevada-California border again, this time heading eastbound with a load of agricultural equipment. I'd told myself I wouldn't take this route again, that I'd request different assignments, stick to highways that didn't pass through that particular stretch of desert. But here's the thing about long-haul trucking. You don't always get to choose your routes. The loads go where they go, and you go with them, or you don't work. Simple as that. So, when dispatch called with this run, I took it. Told myself it would be fine. Told myself that whatever had happened before was just exhaustion and coincidence, and the natural strangeness of driving alone through empty places at odd hours. I'd been planning to time it so I'd cross the state line during daylight, but a delayed pickup in Sacramento put me behind schedule. By the time I reached the border, the sun had already set, and that familiar desert darkness was settling in like something physical, something with weight and presence. The temperature had dropped fast, the way it does out here when the sun disappears, and I had the heater running low, just enough to take the edge off. The radio was playing classic rock out of Reno, and I kept the CB on, volume set just loud enough to hear any traffic without it being intrusive. I checked the time compulsively as I drove. 10:15 p.m., 10:22 pa, 10:30 p.m. Each glance at the clock felt like I was counting down to something, though I couldn't have said what. The rational part of my brain kept insisting that 2:47 a.m. was hours away, that I'd be long past this section of highway by then, probably pulled over for the night at a truck stop with bright lights and other people around. But another part of me, the part that had learned to trust instinct over logic, knew better. Time and distance didn't work the same way out here. Not anymore. Not since that first night. Mile markers clicked past with mechanical regularity. Marker 45. Marker 46. I was watching for it now, scanning the road ahead for any sign of that overpass. My hands tight on the wheel, my shoulders tense. The highway curved gently through the darkness, following the natural contours of the land, and I found myself reading the landscape differently than before, looking for the telltale rise of an elevated structure, the break in the horizon that would signal its approach. But the road stayed flat, stayed empty, and slowly, gradually, I started to relax. Maybe it wouldn't appear this time. Maybe whatever connection had formed between us had been severed, dissolved by time and distance and the simple act of moving forward. At 11:43 p.m., I passed under an overpass. Not the overpass, just a normal structure carrying a county road over the highway, well lit by a pair of sodium vapor lamps, their orange glow pushing back the darkness. A pickup truck sat on the overpass, its hazard lights blinking, and I could see the silhouette of someone standing by the hood, probably dealing with engine trouble. Normal. Real. I gave 2 short blasts on my air horn as I passed, a show of solidarity between travelers, and I saw the figure wave in response. The sight of another human being, even just their shadow, filled me with a relief so intense it was almost physical. I wasn't alone out here. The world was still solid, still followable, still bound by rules I understood. But then I checked my mirrors, just a casual glance to see if the pickup driver needed help, and the overpass was gone. Not just empty, but absent. The space where it should have been showing nothing but desert and stars. I blinked, looked again, and it was back. The orange light steady, the hazard flashers still blinking. I must have looked away, must have been checking a different mirror. My eyes were tired, that was all, playing tricks in the darkness. I forced myself to focus on the road ahead, to stop checking the mirrors, to just drive. The CB had been quiet all night, not even the usual scattered chatter between drivers. Just empty channels, and occasional bursts of static that could have been atmospheric interference or distant conversations bleeding through from too far away to make out words. I'd tried reaching out a few times, calling for anyone listening, but my transmissions vanished into that electronic void without response. It was like driving through a dead zone, a pocket of space where signals couldn't reach, where you were cut off from the network of voices that normally spans the highways. Being alone in the cab was one thing. Being alone on the radio was something else entirely. At 2:15 a.m., I started looking for a place to stop. Not because I was tired, though I should have been after nearly 6 hours of driving. Not because I needed fuel or food, or any of the normal reasons a driver pulls over. I wanted to be stopped. Wanted to have the engine off and the parking brakes set and my feet on solid ground when 247 rolled around. Some superstitious part of me believed that if I wasn't moving, if I wasn't actively traveling along that highway, then maybe the pattern would break. Maybe the overpass would pass me by, would find some other driver to shadow, some other route to haunt. I saw a rest area sign at mile marker 68. 2 miles ahead, the standard blue highway symbol showing parking and restrooms and picnic tables. Perfect. I could pull in, kill a half hour, let 247 come and go while I was safely parked with other travelers around me. I moved into the right lane, started slowing down, and that's when I noticed something wrong with the mile markers. The last one I'd passed had been 68, but the next one said 66. I was going backwards, or the markers were. Either way, the math didn't work, couldn't work, but there was the number glowing in my headlights, clear and undeniable. Mile marker 66. I kept driving, my speed dropping to 50 now, my eyes fixed on the roadside markers. Marker 65, marker 64. The rest area sign flashed past on my right, but when I looked for the exit, there was nothing there, just highway shoulder and darkness. The countdown continued. Marker 63, marker 62. And then I saw it rising in the distance, that familiar shape breaking the horizon. And I knew with absolute certainty that I'd been driving toward it all along, that every mile I'd covered had somehow been bringing me closer to this moment, this place, this structure that existed outside the normal flow of distance and direction. The CB crackled at 2:46 a.m., 1 minute early, and through the static I heard something that made every hair on my body stand up. It was a voice, distorted and broken, but definitely a voice, and it was saying numbers. Marker 47, marker 47, over and over, in a flat, mechanical cadence that didn't sound quite human. I grabbed the mic, my thumb hovering over the transmit button, but I didn't key it. What would I say? Who was I trying to reach? The voice on the CB wasn't calling for help. It was calling out a location. It was marking territory. At 2:47 a.m. exactly, I passed under the overpass. This time, I was ready for it. My high beams on, my eyes searching the darkness under the structure for that hanging shadow. And I saw it. Not just a shape this time, but detail. It was wrong in ways I couldn't quite process, wrong in ways that made my vision blur when I tried to focus on it directly. It had depth but no substance, movement but no form, and where my headlights hit it, the light didn't reflect or absorb. It just stopped, like the shadow was eating the photons, pulling them into itself and giving nothing back. The span of time under the overpass felt stretched, extended beyond what physics should have allowed. My speedometer showed 60 miles per hour, but it felt like I was crawling, like the space beneath the structure was somehow longer than it should be. The distance between the entry and exit multiplied by some factor I couldn't calculate. And in that extended moment, I saw movement in my peripheral vision. Saw that shadow shift and flow and reach. Saw appendages or branches or something that defied description extending from the main mass, reaching down toward my cab, getting closer, closer, almost touching. Then I was through. Back into open highway. Back into normal space and normal time. My speedometer still showed 60. My odometer clicked over normally, and the CB went silent. I exhaled hard, realized I'd been holding my breath, realized my knuckles were white on the steering wheel and my jaw was clenched so tight it ached. I forced myself to relax, forced my hands to loosen their grip, but I couldn't stop the trembling that had started in my arms and was spreading through my whole body. I kept driving for another 10 minutes before I dared to check the mirrors. When I finally did, I saw nothing but empty highway stretching back into darkness. The overpass was gone, or I'd left it behind, or it had released me. I didn't know which. Didn't want to know. I just wanted to put distance between us. Wanted to fill the space with miles and minutes and the comfortable routine of driving. But I couldn't shake the image of that shadow. Couldn't stop seeing it in my mind's eye. Couldn't stop wondering what would have happened if I'd been going slower, if that moment under the overpass had stretched just a little longer, if those reaching appendages had actually touched the roof of my cab. The rest area I'd been looking for finally appeared at mile marker 83, the number sequence running forward again, running normal. I pulled in without hesitation, guided my rig into a parking spot between two other trucks, their running lights showing signs of life, their drivers presumably sleeping in their cabs. I set the parking brake, killed the engine, and just sat there in the sudden silence, listening to the tick of cooling metal, the distant rush of highway traffic, the ordinary sounds of the ordinary world. My hands were still shaking, my heart was still racing, but I was stopped. I was safe, or at least that's what I told myself. I climbed out of the cab on unsteady legs, my boots crunching on gravel as I walked toward the rest area building. It was a simple structure, brick and glass and fluorescent lights, the kind of place that exists only as a waypoint, a brief intersection with civilization in the midst of long journeys. The lights were bright, almost painfully so after hours of darkness, and I squinted as I pushed through the glass doors. The restrooms were empty, cleaned recently enough that the smell of industrial disinfectant still hung in the air. I splashed cold water on my face, looked at myself in the mirror, and barely recognized what I saw. My eyes were bloodshot, my face pale, and there was something in my expression that hadn't been there before. Not fear, exactly, more like knowledge. The look of someone who's seen something they can't unsee, learned something they can't unlearn. I bought coffee from a vending machine, the kind that tastes like burnt rubber and regret, and carried it outside to one of the picnic tables. The night air was cold and clean, and I stood there breathing it in, trying to clear my head, trying to process what had happened. Other trucks were pulling in and out of the rest area, their air brakes hissing, their engines rumbling, and the normality of it all felt surreal. How could they just keep driving? How could they pass through that same stretch of highway without noticing? Was I the only one who saw it, or were there others, other drivers who'd encountered that overpass and never spoke about it, who kept their experiences locked away because talking about it would make them sound crazy? I pulled out my phone, thinking I'd search online, see if anyone else had reported strange experiences on this highway. But I had no signal. The rest area was in a dead zone, too far from any cell towers to pick up coverage. Just like the CB, just like everything out here, I was cut off, isolated, left to figure this out on my own. I drank the terrible coffee and waited for dawn, watching the eastern horizon for the first hint of light. And when the sun finally rose, painting the desert in shades of orange and gold, I felt something like relief. Daylight meant safety. Daylight meant the rules went back to normal. I climbed back into my cab around 7 a.m., after other drivers had started moving, after the parking lot had filled with the sounds of engines starting and gears shifting and the normal business of the road resuming. I checked my logbook, calculated my hours, and realized I needed to keep moving if I was going to make my delivery on time. The eastbound highway stretched ahead, and I pulled onto it without looking back, without checking my mirrors for any sign of that overpass. I didn't want to know if it was still there. Didn't want to give it any more attention than I already had. But as I merged into traffic, as I settled into the rhythm of driving and the comfortable monotony of mile markers passing by, I caught myself watching the clock. 2:47 a.m. was hours away, but I was already counting down to it, already dreading it, already knowing that tonight, and every night after, I'd be watching for it. The overpass had marked me somehow, had established some kind of connection I didn't understand. and I knew with cold certainty that no matter what route I took, no matter how far I drove, eventually I'd see it again. Rising out of the darkness, waiting. 2 weeks passed before I saw it again, and in that time I'd almost convinced myself it had been a hallucination. Stress, exhaustion, too much coffee, and not enough sleep combining to create something that felt real but wasn't. I'd even laughed about it with another driver at a truck stop in Utah, telling the story like it was a joke, like I was in on the punchline. "You ever see something so weird you can't even describe it?" I'd said, and he'd nodded, launched into his own tale about lights in the sky near Roswell. We'd laughed, drank our coffee, and gone our separate ways. Normal trucker talk, normal road stories. But then I took a run from Portland to Boise, a straightforward route I'd driven dozens of times, and at 2:47 a.m. on a clear November night, the CB filled with static, and that voice came through again. Marker 47, marker 47. The same flat cadence, the same mechanical repetition, and when I looked up at the road ahead, there it was. The overpass. Impossible, because this highway didn't have an overpass at this location, had never had one, but impossible didn't seem to mean much anymore. It stood there in the darkness like it had been waiting, and I knew I had no choice but to pass beneath it. I'd prepared for this moment, or thought I had. I'd installed a second dash cam, one that recorded continuously and uploaded footage to cloud storage every few hours. I'd bought a digital voice recorder and kept it running whenever I drove at night, documenting my location and any unusual experiences. I'd even started keeping a detailed journal, writing down mile markers and timestamps and weather conditions, trying to find a pattern, trying to understand the rules of whatever game I was playing. But as I approached that overpass, all my preparations felt useless. What good was documentation against something that shouldn't exist? The shadow under the structure was darker this time, more substantial, and as I got closer I could see it moving with purpose, pulsing like a heartbeat, expanding and contracting in rhythm with something I couldn't hear. My foot eased off the accelerator instinctively, my speed dropping from 70 to 60 to 50, and the slower I went, the more detail I could see. The shadow had texture now, not smooth, but layered, like it was made of overlapping sheets of darkness folded on top of each other. And within those layers I thought I saw shapes, suggestions of form, almost faces that appeared and dissolved before I could focus on them. I grabbed the CB mic, keyed it, and spoke into the static. "What do you want?" My voice sounded strange, too loud in the quiet of the cab, and I immediately felt foolish. What did I expect? An answer? A revelation? But the static shifted, changed pitch, and through it I heard that voice again, but this time it said something different. Not marker 47. Something else. Something that sounded like my name. Roy. 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 Over and over in that same mechanical cadence, and the sound of it made my skin crawl. I passed under the overpass doing 40, my hands locked on the wheel, my eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to look at the shadow, even though every instinct screamed at me to watch it, to track its movement, to know where it was. The moment stretched again, that same temporal distortion, and this time I heard something else. A sound like wind, but not wind, more like breathing, deep, slow, rhythmic breathing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, that filled the cab despite the windows being closed, that made the air feel thick and hard to pull into my lungs. Then I was through, back into normal space, and the breathing stopped. The CB went silent, and I realized with a jolt that something had changed in my cab. The temperature had dropped, not gradually but instantly, and I could see my breath misting in the air. My heater was still running, still set to the same temperature it had been, but the cab felt like a freezer. I cranked the heat up to maximum, held my hands in front of the vents, and waited for warmth that was slow to come. Even after 10 minutes of driving, even after the temperature gauge showed normal, I couldn't shake the chill that had settled into my bones. I pulled into a truck stop outside of Twin Falls around 4 a.m., parked under the brightest lights I could find, and went through my vehicle inspection like I was searching for contraband. I checked every panel, every door, every possible place something could hide or attach itself, looking for I don't know what. Evidence. Proof. Some physical trace of what had happened under that overpass. But there was nothing. The rig was clean, normal, exactly as it should be, and yet I knew something had changed. Something had come back with me. I didn't sleep that day. Couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow, saw those almost faces shifting in the darkness, heard my name spoken in that mechanical voice. I drank coffee until my hands shook, ate food I couldn't taste, and checked my cameras obsessively, reviewing footage from the night before. The recordings showed exactly what I'd experienced. The overpass appearing on an empty stretch of highway, the dashcam's view going dark for exactly 37 seconds as I passed underneath, then returning to normal. But the thermal camera I'd mounted to capture the underside of the structure showed something else. Something I watched 3 times before I could fully process it. The shadow showed up on thermal imaging, not as cold or hot, but as absence. A void in the electromagnetic spectrum where no heat signature registered, where even ambient temperature seemed to disappear. And as my truck passed beneath it, tendrils of that void reached down, touched the roof of my cab, and seemed to probe, to search, to taste. The contact lasted less than 2 seconds, but I could see the impact. A small patch of my cab's thermal signature changed, dimmed, like heat was being drawn out of the metal, like something was feeding. I showed the footage to a mechanic at the truck stop, told him I was worried about insulation failure, about heat loss in the cab. He looked at the thermal images, frowned, and said he'd never seen anything like it. Offered to check my roof panels, but when he climbed up to inspect them, he found nothing wrong. No damage, no wear, no explanation for the cold spot that was clearly visible in the footage. He climbed down looking puzzled, told me it was probably just a camera glitch, and suggested I get the thermal unit recalibrated. I thanked him, paid for diesel I didn't need, and got back on the road. The next encounter happened 3 nights later, on a different highway in a different state, and then 4 nights after that, and then 2 nights after that. The intervals were getting shorter, the appearances more frequent, and I started to notice other changes. Mile markers near the overpass always seemed wrong, running backward or skipping numbers or repeating. The GPS would show my location shifting slightly, placing me a 1/4 mile or half a mile from where I actually was. And the CB, even when the overpass wasn't visible, would crackle with that static at 2:47 a.m., like it was marking time, counting down to the next appearance. Other drivers started to notice something was off about me. I could see it in their expressions when I'd pull into truck stops, the way they'd glance at my rig and then away, like there was something about it they didn't want to acknowledge. A few times, people I knew, drivers I'd been friendly with for years, wouldn't make eye contact, wouldn't engage in conversation. One guy I'd known since my rookie years, a veteran hauler named Dale, who taught me half of what I know about the road, actually crossed to the other side of a parking lot to avoid passing near my truck. When I caught up with him later and asked what was wrong, he just shook his head and said, "Can't explain it, Roy. Something about your rig just feels off. You might want to get it blessed or something." I laughed it off at the time, but his words stuck with me. Get it blessed. Like the truck was cursed. like something from those old trucker legends about haunted highways and ghost riders had attached itself to my vehicle. I'd always dismissed those stories as entertainment, campfire tales to pass the time, but now I wasn't so sure. Maybe there was truth in them. Maybe other drivers had experienced exactly what I was going through, and the stories were their way of warning others, of putting language to something that defied description. I started researching online during my downtime, searching for any reports of strange overpasses, unusual structures, temporal anomalies on highways. I found more than I expected. Forums full of drivers describing experiences similar to mine. Structures appearing where they shouldn't. Time distortions. Shadows that moved with purpose. Most of the posts were old, some dating back years, and most of them ended the same way. The driver would post their initial experience, would document one or two follow-ups, and then would go silent. No final update. No resolution, just absence. I tried contacting some of them, sending private messages asking if they'd found answers, if they'd figured out how to make it stop. Most messages went unanswered. A few bounced back with notifications that the accounts had been deleted, but one driver, a woman who'd posted about a similar overpass in New Mexico, wrote back. Her message was brief, typed in all lowercase like she was too tired for proper grammar. Stopped driving, sold my rig, got an office job. Still see it sometimes when I close my eyes. Don't know if it ever really lets go. Sorry I can't help. Good luck. That message terrified me more than any of the encounters with the overpass itself. The idea that it might be permanent, that even leaving the road wouldn't free me from it made everything feel hopeless. But I couldn't stop driving. This was my life, my career, my identity. I was a trucker, it was all I knew how to be. So I kept taking loads, kept covering miles, and kept watching the clock count down to 2:47 a.m. every night, knowing that sooner or later I'd see that overpass rising in the darkness ahead. The rest areas became my refuge. I started timing my routes to ensure I'd be parked somewhere, anywhere. When 2:47 rolled around, I'd pull in around 2 a.m., kill the engine, and sit there in the cab with all the lights on, watching the clock, waiting for the moment to pass. And most nights, it worked. Most nights, the static would come and go without the overpass appearing, and I'd breathe a sigh of relief and know I was safe for another 24 hours. But not always. Sometimes, even parked, even surrounded by other trucks and lights and the infrastructure of civilization, I'd look out my windshield at 2:47 a.m. and see it there, just beyond the rest area's fence, standing in empty desert where no structure should be, its shadow pooling under the lights like spilled ink. Those nights were the worst, knowing it was close, knowing it was watching, knowing that the only thing protecting me was a chain-link fence and a couple hundred yards of parking lot. I started sleeping during the day, forcing myself to adjust my schedule so I'd be awake at night, alert when the overpass was most likely to appear. My logbook became a mess of violation entries, hours that didn't add up, rest periods that happened at the wrong times. Dispatch started asking questions, suggesting I might need to take some time off, see a doctor, get my head straight. But I couldn't explain, couldn't tell them the truth, so I just kept driving. It was mid-December when everything changed, when I learned the truth about the overpass, when I understood that what I'd been experiencing wasn't supernatural or paranormal, or any of the other words we use to describe things we don't understand. It was worse than that. It was geographical. I'd taken a load from Denver to Sacramento, a route that took me back through that same stretch of Nevada-California border where it had all started. I'd been avoiding this specific highway for weeks, but my dispatcher had been insistent, had even implied that my job might be at risk if I kept turning down assignments. So I'd accepted, told myself I could handle it, told myself that maybe enough time had passed that the overpass would leave me alone. I was wrong. I saw it for the first time around 11 p.m., still 100 miles from the border. It appeared on the roadside, not over the highway but beside it, standing in open desert like someone had built a bridge to nowhere. The structure glowed faintly in my headlights, and I could see that shadow underneath, darker and more substantial than ever before. I kept driving, keeping my eyes on the road, but I could feel it tracking my movement, could feel its attention like a weight on the side of my face. By midnight, I'd seen it 3 more times, always off to the side, always watching, and each time it was closer to the highway, like it was migrating, repositioning itself for something. At 2:30 a.m., I passed a rest area and made a split-second decision to pull in, to try to wait out whatever was coming. But as I slowed down, as I started to move into the exit lane, I saw the overpass standing at the end of the off-ramp, blocking the way into the rest area. Not metaphorically, literally. The structure was there, solid and real, and there was no way to reach the parking area without passing beneath it. I swerved back onto the highway, my heart hammering, and kept driving. The CB crackled at 2:47 a.m., right on schedule, but this time the message was different. Not my name, not marker numbers, just a single word, repeated over and over in that mechanical voice. Tonight, tonight, tonight. I saw the real overpass, the one from that first encounter, appear 5 miles ahead. But this time I could see other structures behind it, a whole line of them stretching back into the darkness like a convoy, like a procession. They were all identical, all casting the same impossible shadow, and they filled the horizon from edge to edge. There was no way around them, no way to turn back. The road only went forward, and forward meant under those structures, through that corridor of darkness that had been waiting for me since October. I thought about stopping, just pulling over to the shoulder and refusing to move, forcing them to come to me if they wanted me. But I knew instinctively that stopping was worse, that the only safety was in motion, in pushing through whatever was waiting ahead. So I kept my speed steady at 65, watched the first overpass grow larger in my windshield, and prepared myself for what was coming. The moment I passed under the first structure, everything changed. The world outside my windows disappeared, replaced by that same deep darkness I'd seen in the thermal footage, that void where heat and light and everything else went to die. My headlights stopped working, not because they'd failed, but because there was nothing for them to illuminate. The dashboard lights stayed on, casting a faint glow over the interior of the cab, but everything beyond my windshield was absolute absence. I could still feel the truck moving, could feel the vibration of tires on asphalt, could hear the engine running steady, but I had no sense of direction, no sense of speed, no sense of how far I'd traveled or how much farther I had to go. The odometer stopped advancing. The GPS showed nothing but a blank screen, and the clock, the digital clock that had been my constant companion, my marker of time and progress, was frozen at 2:47 a.m. I don't know how long I drove through that darkness. It could have been minutes or hours or days. Time had stopped meaning anything, had dissolved into that same void that surrounded my truck. But I kept my hands on the wheel and my foot steady on the accelerator, kept moving forward because forward was all I had left. And then, gradually, I started to see things in the darkness. Not shapes exactly, more like the memory of shapes, after images of things that might have once been real. I saw other trucks, dozens of them, all driving in the same direction, all trapped in the same void. I saw their drivers through their windows, saw their faces locked in expressions of terror or confusion or resignation, and I understood that I wasn't alone in this, that the overpass had been collecting us, gathering us, drawing us all into this space between spaces. I saw buildings that looked like rest areas but weren't, structures that held perfect copies of the facilities I'd visited over the years but were somehow wrong, somehow hollow. I saw mile markers counting up and down simultaneously, showing numbers that didn't exist, coordinates for places that had never been mapped. And I saw the shadow, the thing that lived under the overpass, and realized it wasn't one entity but many. A whole network of them spanning the highway system, feeding on the isolation and exhaustion and loneliness that every long-haul driver carries with them. Then, without warning, without transition, I was through. Back into normal space. Back into the real world. Dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, and I was on a highway that looked familiar but wasn't quite right. The mile markers were wrong, the exit signs showed towns I'd never heard of, and my GPS had reset itself completely, showing no history, no saved locations, no record of any of the routes I'd driven. I pulled over at the first opportunity, killed the engine, and just sat there as the sun rose higher, washing the darkness away, making everything look normal and safe and real. But I knew better now. I'd seen what waited under those overpasses, had experienced firsthand the space between the places we know, the void that exists in the margins of our maps and routes and schedules. And I understood that I'd never really escape it, that it would always be there, waiting for 2:47 a.m., waiting for the moment when I was alone and isolated and vulnerable. I called my dispatcher that morning, told them I needed time off, told them I wasn't feeling well. They gave me 2 weeks, and I spent that time trying to research what had happened, trying to find some official record of that overpass, some proof that it existed outside my own experience. What I found was worse than nothing. I found accident reports from that section of highway, dozens of them, all clustered around the same general area. Trucks that had driven off the road for no apparent reason. Drivers who'd been found dead in their cabs with no signs of injury or distress. Vehicles that had simply vanished between 1 mile marker and the next, never to be seen again. The reports went back decades, all the way to when the highway was first built, and they all shared the same details. The incidents happened at night, usually between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., and they always occurred near mile marker 47. I dug deeper, found historical records about the highway's construction, and learned something that made my blood run cold. The original plans had included an overpass at mile marker 47, a structure meant to carry a county service road over the highway. But during construction, the overpass had collapsed, killing 3 workers. The project was abandoned, the bodies never recovered, and the service road was rerouted. According to official records, no overpass was ever completed at that location. The structure I'd been driving under for months, the thing that had been stalking me across multiple states, had never existed in the physical world. But it existed somewhere, in some space between intention and reality, between what was planned and what was built. That overpass had taken form, and it was still there, still reaching out across the highway system, still pulling drivers into whatever void it had created. The workers who'd died during the collapse, were they part of it now? Were they the intelligence behind those shadows, the consciousness that spoke my name through static? I didn't know, couldn't know. But I understood that the overpass was permanent, that it would outlast every driver who encountered it, that it would keep appearing and disappearing and collecting us one by one until every stretch of highway was infected with its presence. I went back to work after 2 weeks, not because I felt ready, but because I had no choice. Bills needed paying. Life needed living. And the road was all I knew. But I drive different now. I avoid the Nevada-California border. I never run routes at night if I can help it. And most importantly, I keep my CB off between 2:45 and 2:50 a.m. every night, because I don't want to hear that static. Don't want to know if it's calling my name. Don't want any reminder of what's waiting out there in the darkness. But sometimes, despite all my precautions, I'll glance at my mirrors and see it there in the distance. That overpass, standing alone in empty desert, or hovering over an empty stretch of highway, its shadow pooling underneath like oil. And I know it hasn't forgotten me. No, it never will. Because I passed through its darkness and came out the other side. And that kind of contact leaves a mark, creates a connection that distance and time can't sever. Other drivers see it too. I know they do. I've learned to recognize the look, that same haunted expression I wore for months, that same exhaustion that comes from dreading nightfall. We don't talk about it. Don't compare notes. Don't try to warn each other. Because what would we say? There's an overpass that doesn't exist, and if you drive under it enough times, it might pull you into a darkness you'll never escape. Who would believe that? Who would take that seriously? So we keep driving, keep hauling our loads across the country, keep passing under overpasses that might or might not be real, might or might not be watching us, might or might not be waiting for that perfect moment to reach out and pull us into whatever space exists between the places we know. And we mark time by the clock, and we trust our maps, and we pretend that the road is just the road, that distance is real and time is linear and the world makes sense. But late at night, when I'm alone in my cab and the highway stretches empty ahead of me, I sometimes wonder how many of us are left. How many drivers are still out here, still running from or toward those structures that shouldn't exist. And I wonder what will happen when the last of us finally passes through that darkness and doesn't come back. Will the overpasses fade away? Will they find new prey? Or will they just keep standing there in the margins of reality, waiting for the next generation of drivers to discover them, to pass beneath them, to learn what we've learned? I don't have answers. Only questions, and the certain knowledge that at 2:47 a.m. tonight, and every night after, I'll be watching for it. That overpass, my overpass, the one that marked me, that knows my name, that's waiting for me somewhere out there in the darkness between mile markers, between moments, between the real world and whatever lies beyond it. The road goes on forever. And so does the overpass. And so, I suppose, do I. Driving, always watching, always waiting for that shadow to appear in my headlights and claim what it thinks belongs to it. But not tonight. Please, not tonight. "22 years on the road teaches you to trust your tools. Your maps, your GPS, your instincts, they all work together to keep you on course, to get you from point A to point B without incident. You learn which truck stops have the cleanest showers, which stretches of highway get dangerous in bad weather, which shortcuts actually save time, and which ones just waste fuel. The job is about patterns and routines, about building a system that works and sticking to it. So when your GPS tells you to do something that doesn't make sense, that goes against every map you've ever read and every route you've ever run, you notice, you pay attention, and if you're smart, you don't follow it. I'm Mason Cole, and I've been hauling freight across the Southwest since 2001. I know these roads like I know my own face in the mirror, every curve and grade and peculiarity. The desert routes are my specialty. The long, empty stretches through New Mexico and Arizona where you can drive for an hour without seeing another vehicle, where the landscape doesn't change and time seems to move differently. Most drivers hate these runs, find them boring or unsettling, but I've always found them peaceful. There's a clarity in that emptiness, a simplicity that makes everything else fall away. Just you and the road and the endless sky. This particular trip started in Albuquerque on a Tuesday afternoon in late March. I'd picked up a load of construction materials bound for a development project outside of Las Cruces. Standard freight. Nothing special. The weather was perfect. Clear skies and mild temperatures, the kind of day that makes you remember why you chose this life. I pulled out of the loading dock around 2 p.m., got myself situated on I-25 South, and settled in for what should have been a straightforward 4-hour drive. The interstate was quiet that afternoon, just a few cars and the occasional semi moving in either direction. I had the radio tuned to a Navajo station out of Gallup, traditional music mixing with contemporary sounds, and the CB was set to channel 19 with the volume low. Everything felt normal, routine, exactly as it should be. I passed through Socorro around 3:30, watched the VLA radio telescope array spread across the plains to the west, and continued south into the emptiness that characterizes this part of New Mexico. Around 4:45 p.m., maybe 20 miles north of Truth or Consequences, my GPS started acting strange. Not broken exactly, but confused. The screen flickered once, twice, and when it stabilized, the route it was showing didn't match what I knew. According to the GPS, I should take exit 34B in 12 miles, a route that would save me almost 40 minutes and get me to Las Cruces well ahead of schedule. I frowned at the screen, tried to reconcile what it was telling me with what I knew about this highway. There was no exit 34B on this stretch. Exit 34 existed, a standard off-ramp leading to a state road that connected to a few small towns, but there had never been a B designation, never been a secondary exit at that location. I glanced at the printed atlas I kept wedged between the seats, the old-school backup that had saved me more times than I could count when technology failed. According to the atlas, exit 34 was a simple, single off-ramp with no branches or alternatives. The GPS had to be wrong, displaying outdated information or pulling data from some corrupted file. It happened sometimes, especially in rural areas where road changes didn't get updated promptly in the databases. I made a mental note to ignore the suggested route and stick to I-25 all the way to Las Cruces just like I'd planned. But the GPS kept insisting. Every few minutes it would chime and display a new notification. Faster route available via exit 34B. The estimated time savings grew more specific. 37 minutes, then 42, then 39. The precision struck me as odd, like the system was calculating something in real time, adjusting its predictions based on conditions I couldn't see. I tried changing the settings, telling the GPS to stick to major highways only, to avoid unpaved roads, to prioritize my original route. Nothing worked. It kept showing that exit, kept promising time savings, kept chiming with increasing frequency. By the time I reached the 10-mile marker before exit 34, the GPS had become almost frantic in its insistence. The screen pulsed with notifications, the chimes sounding every 30 seconds, and the route display had zoomed in to show exit 34B in detail. According to this view, the exit split from exit 34 about halfway down the off-ramp, branching to the east on a road that curved around a series of low hills before rejoining the interstate 40 miles south. The road looked legitimate in the GPS rendering, marked as a state highway with a proper designation, NM 447. I'd never heard of it, never seen it on any map, but the GPS displayed it with the same authority it showed every other road in its database. I passed a sign marking 5 miles to exit 34, and that's when I noticed something that made my hands tighten on the wheel. The landscape around me had changed, subtly, but definitely. The hills that had been visible to the east were closer now, arranged differently than I remembered, and the quality of light had shifted. It wasn't quite sunset, wouldn't be for another 2 hours, but the sun seemed lower, the shadows longer, like time had jumped forward without my noticing. I checked the dashboard clock, 5:03 p.m. Exactly when it should be. But the light was wrong. The CB crackled with a brief burst of static, just enough to make me glance at it, but no voices came through. The channel indicator showed 19, same as always, but the signal strength meter was fluctuating wildly, bouncing from full bars to nothing and back again. I keyed the mic, called out for anyone listening, but got only silence in return. Not even static, just empty air, like I was transmitting into a void. Exit 34 appeared ahead, the green highway sign exactly where it should be, and I started to move into the right lane out of habit before I remembered I wasn't taking it. But as I drew closer, I saw something that made me ease off the accelerator and stare. The exit sign had 2 arrows, one pointing to the standard off-ramp marked Exit 34, State Road 187. And below it, smaller but clearly visible, another arrow pointing to a split in the ramp itself. Exit 34B, State Highway 447. The sign was official, proper green reflective material with white lettering, identical in style to every other exit sign on the interstate. It looked like it had been there for decades, weathered and faded by years of desert sun. I checked my mirrors, saw no traffic behind me, and made a decision I'd spend weeks questioning. I took the exit, not because I believed the GPS, not because I thought the route would actually save time, but because I needed to know, needed to see where that secondary exit led, needed to understand how a road could exist in reality but not on any map I'd ever studied. Curiosity, that's what I told myself. Professional thoroughness. The desire to update my own knowledge of these routes. But looking back, I think it was something else. I think the road wanted me to take it. And I think, on some level, I didn't consciously acknowledge, I knew that. The off-ramp curved down from the interstate in a smooth arc, exactly like 1,000 other exits I'd navigated. But halfway down, I saw it. A split in the pavement. A branch leading east while the main ramp continued west towards State Road 187. The branch was marked with a small blue sign, 447 East. The asphalt was older here, more cracked and faded than the main ramp, and tumbleweeds had piled up along the edges, but the road was clearly maintained, clearly passable. Someone used this route. Someone knew it existed. I guided my rig onto 447 East, felt the change in the road surface immediately. The asphalt was rougher, more textured, and the tires hummed at a different pitch. The highway curved around those low hills I'd noticed earlier, following the natural contours of the land, and within minutes the interstate had disappeared behind me, hidden by terrain and distance. I was alone on this road, no other vehicles visible in either direction, and the landscape around me felt different from the desert I'd been driving through all afternoon. The vegetation was sparser, the soil darker, and the rock formations had a quality I couldn't quite name. They looked older somehow, more weathered, like they'd been sitting here longer than the surrounding landscape. The GPS showed me moving along Highway 447, my blue dot progressing eastward at exactly the speed my speedometer indicated. According to the display, I'd rejoin I-25 in 38 miles, coming out south of Truth or Consequences with that promised time savings intact. The road ahead was straight and empty, disappearing into heat shimmer on the horizon, and I settled into the rhythm of driving, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had been building since I took the exit. That's when I noticed the mile markers. They were there, small green signs on the roadside showing the distance, but the numbers were wrong. The first marker after the exit showed mile 23, which made no sense given that the road had only just branched off. I watched for the next marker, expecting to see mile 24, but it showed mile 19. Then mile 14. The numbers were counting down instead of up, running backward toward some destination I couldn't predict. I tried to remember if I'd ever seen mile markers that counted in reverse, if that was a normal thing on state highways, but I couldn't recall a single instance. Mile markers always counted up, always measured distance from some fixed starting point. They didn't run backward. That wasn't how they worked. The sun was definitely lower now, dropping toward the western horizon faster than it should, and the shadows stretching across the road were too long for 5 p.m. I checked the clock again, 5:17 p.m., but the light said 6:30, maybe later. Time and space weren't syncing up, weren't following the rules I'd spent my entire career relying on. I thought about turning around, about backtracking to the interstate and forgetting this entire detour. But the road behind me looked different than the road ahead. It seemed narrower somehow, less defined, and I couldn't shake the feeling that going backward would be worse than continuing forward. So I kept driving, watching the mile markers count down, watching the light change in ways that didn't match the clock, and trying to ignore the growing certainty that I'd made a terrible mistake. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless, and somewhere in the distance I could see something dark on the horizon. Not hills, not clouds, but something else, something that looked almost like buildings. A town, maybe, or the ghost of one. And according to the GPS, I was heading straight toward it. Mile marker 7 appeared on my right at 5:34 p.m., and that's when I saw the first structure. It was just a house, or what remained of one, sitting maybe 100 yards off the highway. Adobe construction, the walls still intact but the roof partially collapsed, windows empty of glass and dark inside. Nothing unusual about it. Abandoned homesteads dot the New Mexico desert like punctuation marks, remnants of failed ranches and forgotten settlements. But something about this particular building made me slow down, made me stare at it as I passed. The walls were too clean. No graffiti, no obvious decay, no signs of the slow deterioration that happens to structures left to the elements. It looked abandoned, but not old, like someone had walked away from it last week instead of decades ago. I kept driving, and more structures appeared. A gas station with a single pump, the metal housing rusted but still standing. A small grocery store, its windows intact but displaying nothing inside. A handful of houses lined up along what might have been a main street, all in that same state of pristine abandonment. And then, at mile marker 3, I saw the sign, "Welcome to Madera Springs, population 342. The sign was old, the paint faded and peeling, but the lettering was still readable. Below the population number, someone had added in smaller letters, "A good place to stop." I'd never heard of Madera Springs, never seen it on any map, never heard another driver mention it, never seen it listed in any of the truck stop guides or travel directories I'd consulted over the years. But here it was, a town that existed in physical space, even if it didn't exist in documented reality. The GPS showed my position clearly, the blue dot moving along Highway 447, but it didn't show the town. The map display remained blank except for the road itself. No labels or markers indicating human habitation. The highway became a main street, the asphalt transitioning to older concrete marked with expansion joints that thumped under my tires at regular intervals. Buildings lined both sides of the street now, maybe 24 structures in total, forming a small downtown area. I slowed to 30, then 25, my eyes scanning the buildings as I passed. There was a diner, its neon sign dark but intact, advertising fresh pie daily. A hardware store with a sun-faded awning. A post office that still had an American flag hanging from a pole out front, the fabric bleached nearly white by exposure. A small hotel, 2 stories with a sign reading, "Madera Springs Inn, vacancy." Everything was empty, every window dark, every parking space vacant. But the street was clean. That's what struck me as I drove through, what made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The street was too clean. No debris, no tumbleweeds, no sand drifted into corners or piled against buildings. The glass in the windows was intact, unbroken, almost sparkling in the strange afternoon light. The awnings weren't torn or hanging loose. The paint on the buildings was faded but not peeling. It was like the town had been abandoned yesterday, like everyone had simply walked away and left everything as it was, expecting to return. I reached the far end of the main street, where the concrete transitioned back to asphalt and Highway 447 continued east toward the horizon. I should have kept driving. Every instinct I developed over 22 years told me to keep moving, to get out of this town and back to the interstate and forget I'd ever seen this place. But I didn't. Instead, I pulled over to the side of the road, set the parking brake, and killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no birds, no distant traffic noise. Just silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. I climbed out of the cab, my boots hitting pavement that radiated heat from the afternoon sun. The air was warm, but not hot, dry without being uncomfortable, and it carried a smell I couldn't quite identify. Not decay, not dust, but something else. Something almost like fresh laundry, clean and neutral and artificial. I looked back toward the town, toward those buildings lined up along the main street, and tried to understand what I was seeing. How could a town exist in this condition? How could it be maintained without people? Where had everyone gone, and why hadn't they taken anything with them? I walked back toward the main street, my footsteps echoing off the building facades, loud in the silence. I passed the hotel first, peering through the front windows into a lobby that looked ready for guests. The furniture was arranged normally, chairs positioned around a coffee table, a desk with a bell sitting on top, even a potted plant that should have been dead, but looked almost healthy. Dust covered everything, but not the thick accumulation you'd expect from years of abandonment. Just a light coating, like the building had been empty for a few weeks at most. The diner was next, and that's where I noticed something that made me stop walking, made me stand perfectly still and just stare. The lights were on inside. Not bright, not the full fluorescent glare you'd expect from a commercial kitchen, but dim, like someone had left a few lights on overnight. I could see them through the windows, soft yellow illumination falling across empty booths, and a lunch counter with stools lined up in perfect order. And on the counter, just visible through the window, was a coffee pot sitting on a burner, steam rising from the spout. I tried the door. It was unlocked. The handle turned smoothly, the door swung inward on hinges that didn't squeak, and I stepped into the diner's air-conditioned interior. The temperature difference was immediate, going from the warm afternoon air to a cool 68 degrees in the space of a single step. The air conditioning was running, the lights were on, the coffee was hot, and there wasn't a single person anywhere in sight. "Hello?" My voice sounded wrong, too loud and too small at the same time, swallowed by the space even as it echoed off the walls. No response. I walked deeper into the diner, past booths with menus still sitting on the tables, past a pie case that contained actual pies, past a kitchen door with a window that showed cooking equipment in pristine condition. Everything was ready for business. Everything suggested that customers could walk in at any moment and be served. But there was no one to serve them. I looked at the pies more closely, leaning down to examine them through the glass case. They looked real, not props or displays. I could see the texture of the crust, the glistening of the fruit filling, the way the meringue formed perfect peaks on what appeared to be a lemon pie. But they didn't look fresh. They looked like the idea of fresh, like someone's memory of what a fresh pie should look like. translated into physical form without quite capturing the reality. The colors were slightly too vivid, the textures slightly too perfect, and there was no smell. Fresh pie should fill a diner with aroma, should make your mouth water from across the room. These pies gave off nothing, no scent at all. I left the diner without taking anything, walked back out into the silence of the main street. The sun was lower now, creating long shadows that stretched across the pavement, and I realized I'd lost track of time. I checked my watch, 6:12 p.m. I'd been in the diner for maybe 10 minutes, 15 at most, but over an hour had passed according to my watch, and the light matched that lost hour, showed early evening when it should have been mid-afternoon. I needed to leave, needed to get back in my truck and continue on Highway 447, get to wherever this road actually went, get back to the interstate and the normal world. But as I turned toward my rig, I saw someone. Just for a second. Just a glimpse of movement in one of the second-floor windows of the hotel. A shape, dark against the dim interior, standing perfectly still and looking down at me. I froze, staring up at that window, and the shape didn't move, didn't wave, didn't step back out of sight, just stood there, watching. "Hey!" I called up to the window. "You know where everyone went?" No response. The shape remained motionless, and I couldn't make out any details, couldn't even be certain it was human. It could have been a coat rack, a piece of furniture, a trick of light and shadow. But I didn't think so. It had the weight of presence, the quality of attention, and I could feel it watching me even if I couldn't see its eyes. I backed away from the hotel, keeping my gaze on that second-floor window, and nearly tripped over a curb I hadn't noticed. I caught myself, looked down long enough to find my footing, and when I looked back up, the shape was gone. The window was empty, just dark glass reflecting the sky. I stood there breathing hard, my heart racing, and tried to decide what to do. Go into the hotel? Search for whoever or whatever I'd seen? Or get back in my truck and leave this place behind? The decision was made for me when I heard the sound. It came from somewhere deeper in the town, from one of the side streets I hadn't explored, and it was wrong in ways I struggled to define. It wasn't mechanical, wasn't natural, wasn't anything I could compare to sounds I knew. It was almost like wind chimes, but deeper and more resonant, each note hanging in the air too long before fading. And underneath that, so faint I almost couldn't hear it, something that might have been voices, multiple voices, speaking or singing in unison but too distant and distorted to make out words. I ran for my truck, didn't walk, didn't look back, just ran. My boots pounded on the pavement, each step echoing off the building facades, and I had the irrational certainty that if I looked back, I'd see something I couldn't unsee, something that would change me in ways I couldn't undo. I reached my rig, yanked the door open and climbed inside, slamming it shut and hitting the lock button. My hands were shaking as I turned the key, as the engine rumbled to life, and I'd never been so grateful to hear that familiar diesel sound. I shifted into gear and started moving, accelerating faster than I should have on a town street, pushing 40, then 50, then 60, as I left Madera Springs behind. In my mirrors, I watched the town recede, watched those buildings shrink into the distance, and I swore I saw movement in several of the windows, dark shapes standing motionless and watching me go. The mile markers started counting up now, running in the right direction. Mile 4, mile 5, mile 6, and the landscape began to look normal again, the vegetation and soil matching what I expected from this region of New Mexico. Highway 447 continued east, running straight toward a horizon that shimmered with heat, and I kept my speed at 75, faster than was safe on an unknown road, but I didn't care. I needed distance between me and that town, needed to feel like I was making progress, needed the reassurance of motion and speed. The GPS still showed my route, still indicated I'd rejoin the interstate in another 20 miles, and I clung to that promise like a lifeline. At mile marker 14, the road crested a low rise, and I saw what lay ahead. Nothing. The highway continued for maybe another mile, visible as a ribbon of darker asphalt against the desert floor, and then it just stopped. Not gradually, not transitioning into dirt or gravel, but ending abruptly in a barrier of bare earth, like someone had simply ceased construction partway through the project. Beyond that point, there was no road at all, just empty desert stretching to the horizon. I slowed down, confusion replacing fear, and tried to reconcile what I was seeing with what the GPS showed. According to the screen, Highway 447 continued, connecting back to I-25 in another 15 miles. But my eyes told a different story. The road ended. There was no connection, no continuation, no way forward except to turn around and go back the way I'd come. Back through Madera Springs. Back past that diner with its fresh coffee and perfect pies. Back past those windows with their watching shapes. I pulled over to the shoulder about a quarter mile from where the road ended and sat there with the engine idling, trying to think. The CB was still silent, still showing no traffic on Channel 19. My phone had no signal. Hadn't had signal since I'd taken exit 34B. The GPS showed one reality. My eyes showed another. And I had no way to determine which was true. Or if either was. The sun was setting now, definitely setting. The light taking on that golden quality that precedes dusk. Long shadows stretched across the desert. And in those shadows I thought I saw movement. Shapes that might have been animals, or might have been something else. Something that walked on two legs, but moved wrong. Moved with joints that bent in directions human joints shouldn't bend. I didn't look directly at them. Didn't want to confirm what I was seeing. Just kept my eyes forward, on that ending road, and tried to decide what came next. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes, engine running, hands on the wheel, staring at that point where Highway 447 simply ceased to exist. The rational part of my brain kept insisting this had to make sense somehow, that roads don't just appear and disappear, that towns can't exist without being mapped, that GPS systems don't show routes that aren't real. But the evidence in front of me said otherwise. I'd driven here, I'd walked through that town. I'd seen the lights on in the diner, the steam rising from the coffee pot. None of it should have been possible. But all of it had happened. The shadows were getting longer now, the quality of light shifting from golden to orange to something deeper, more ominous. I needed to make a decision, turn around and go back through Madera Springs, hope I could navigate my way back to exit 34B and the interstate. Or sit here until dark and see what happened when the sun went down completely. Neither option felt safe. Neither option felt smart. But staying put while darkness felt like the worst choice. So I put the transmission in reverse, did a careful 3-point turn on the narrow highway, and started driving back the way I'd come. The mile markers counted down normally now, showing the expected progression as I retraced my route. Mile 13, mile 12, mile 11. The desert on either side looked different than it had on the drive east. The vegetation darker, the rock formations casting shadows that seemed too deep for the available light. But the road itself was solid, real, the pavement rough under my tires but clearly maintained. Someone had built this highway. Someone had put up these mile markers. Someone had created the infrastructure, even if that someone had forgotten to put it on any official maps. Madera Springs appeared at mile marker 3, exactly where I'd left it. The buildings were silhouetted against the darkening sky, windows reflecting the last of the sunlight. And as I approached the edge of town, I saw that more lights had come on, not just in the diner now, but in several buildings. The hotel's lobby was lit. The hardware store had lights in its front windows. Even the gas station showed illumination from what must have been an office or service bay. The town looked occupied, looked ready for business, looked like somewhere you could pull over for dinner and a room and wake up the next morning refreshed. But there were still no people, no cars parked on the street, no pedestrians visible through the lit windows, no signs of actual habitation despite all the indicators of life and activity. I drove through the main street doing 25, my eyes moving between the buildings and the road ahead, and I noticed details I'd missed on the first pass. The post office flag was moving now, responding to a breeze I couldn't feel. The hotel's vacancy sign was lit, blinking steadily, advertising rooms that no one would rent. And the diner, that place with its perfect pies and hot coffee, now had a sign in the window that hadn't been there before. Open 24 hours, it said in red neon script. Come on in. I kept driving. Didn't slow down. Didn't consider stopping. Just maintained my speed and watched those buildings slide past in my peripheral vision. But as I reached the far end of town, as the concrete main street transitioned back to asphalt highway, I glanced in my driver's side mirror and saw someone standing in the middle of the street. A figure, perfectly still, silhouetted against the lights of the diner behind it. It was too far away to make out details, but I could see it was watching me, could see its head tracking my movement as I pulled away from town. And then, just before I looked back at the road ahead, I saw it raise one arm, not waving, not gesturing, just lifting its arm straight up, pointing at the sky, holding that position with inhuman stillness. I accelerated hard, pushing the rig up to 50, then 60, way too fast for safety, but I didn't care. The town disappeared behind me, swallowed by distance and the gathering dusk, and I fixed my attention on finding that split in the highway, that point where 447 branched off from the exit ramp and I could get back to I-25. The GPS still showed my position, still displayed my route, but it wasn't helping. It showed me traveling west on Highway 447, showed the distance to the interstate junction decreasing mile by mile, but it didn't show any landmarks I could use to orient myself. Didn't show anything except that thin red line representing the road. Mile marker 16 passed on my right, and I should have been getting close to the junction by now. I'd entered the highway at mile 23, so the exit should appear somewhere between mile 20 and mile 25, where the secondary route reconnected with exit 34's main ramp. But the mile markers kept counting up, mile 17, mile 18, mile 19, and there was no sign of the junction. Just more highway stretching ahead into the fading light, just more empty desert on either side, just more of this road that shouldn't exist. At mile marker 23, where I should have reached the junction and reconnected with civilization, the highway curved north and kept going. No split, no exit ramp, no sign that this road had ever connected to anything. It just continued, running parallel to where I knew I-25 must be, separated from the interstate by what should have been just a few miles of desert, but felt like an unbridgeable gap. I thought about leaving the highway, about cutting across the open desert and trying to reach I-25 on foot, but that was insane. I had no water, no navigation equipment, and night was coming fast. I'd die out there, lost in the desert, while my truck sat empty on a highway that didn't exist. The CB crackled suddenly, making me jump. Not static this time, but a voice. Broken and distorted, but definitely human. Anyone reading? 447, trapped. I grabbed the mic, keyed it frantically. Yes! I'm reading you. Where are you? Silence. Then more broken transmission. Exit 34B. Don't. Not real. Turn around. The voice cut off, replaced by static, and despite repeated attempts to raise them again, I got no response. Someone else was out here, or had been out here, and they'd tried to warn me. Turn around. But turn around to where? Back to Madeira Springs. Back to that town with its watching shapes and impossible normalcy? Night fell completely at 7:43 p.m., according to my dashboard clock. The transition from dusk to darkness was faster than it should have been, like someone had dimmed the lights in stages rather than letting the sun set naturally. Stars appeared overhead, more of them than I'd ever seen. So many, they formed a continuous carpet of light that made the sky look solid, like a ceiling pressing down. And there, on the northern horizon, I saw lights. Not stars, but artificial lights, a glow that could only mean civilization, a town or city, or at least human habitation. I steered toward those lights, leaving Highway 447 and driving out across the open desert. The terrain was rough, all sand and scrub and scattered rocks, and my rig bounced and swayed as I navigated the uneven ground. I should have stayed on the highway, should have kept to the paved surface, but the lights pulled me forward with magnetic insistence. They represented everything I needed: people, help, a way to understand what was happening. I drove for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes, closing the distance to those lights, getting near enough that I could make out individual points of illumination, could see they were arranged in a grid pattern that suggested streets and buildings. And then I crested a low rise, and I saw what the lights revealed. It was Madeira Springs. The exact same town, the exact same layout, the exact same buildings with their windows lit and their streets empty. Impossible, because I'd driven north, away from where the town should be, in completely the opposite direction. But there was no mistaking it. The same diner with its open 24 hours sign, the same hotel with its blinking vacancy indicator, the same post office with its moving flag. I'd driven in a straight line away from this place, and somehow I'd come right back to it. I stopped the truck at the edge of town, engine idling, and tried to process what I was seeing. The town existed in multiple locations. Or I'd driven in a circle without realizing it. Or space worked differently here, folding back on itself in ways that made normal navigation impossible. I thought about that voice on the CB, the warning to turn around, the insistence that none of this was real. Maybe they were right. Maybe exit 34B didn't exist. Highway 447 had never been built, and Madeira Springs was some kind of projection, a mirage made solid, a trap disguised as a refuge. I backed away from the town, turned the rig eastward again, and drove parallel to the main street without entering it. I could see into the buildings as I passed, could see the diner's interior with its booths and counter, the hardware store's aisles stocked with merchandise, the hotel's lobby with its furniture arranged for guests who would never arrive. And in several of the windows, I saw those shapes again. Dark figures standing motionless, watching me pass. More of them than before, maybe a dozen or more, positioned in different buildings but all oriented toward me, all tracking my movement with that same inhuman stillness. I accelerated, pushing the rig faster across the rough terrain, and the town began to fall behind. But the shapes moved, keeping pace with me, appearing in windows on the far side of town, matching my speed exactly. They weren't walking, weren't running, just relocating instantaneously from one position to another, and I understood with sudden clarity that they weren't separate entities. They were all part of the same thing, the same intelligence, the same presence that inhabited this place. Madeira Springs wasn't a town. It was an organism, a single living system that used the appearance of human civilization to attract and trap travelers who were unlucky or stupid enough to take exit 34B. I drove through the night, staying well clear of the town's borders, trying to find some way out of this pocket of wrong space. The stars overhead remained impossibly bright, casting enough light to navigate by, and gradually I started to recognize landmarks. Not from this particular stretch of desert, but from other places I'd been, other routes I'd driven. That rock formation looked like something from Arizona. That dry wash matched one I'd crossed in Nevada. That pattern of vegetation was pure Colorado Plateau. It was like the desert around me was made of pieces from different locations, stitched together without regard for geographical logic. At some point during the night, probably around 3 a.m. based on my dashboard clock, I found myself back on Highway 447. I hadn't been looking for it, hadn't seen it approach. But suddenly my tires were on pavement instead of sand, and the mile markers were flashing past in my headlights. Mile 8, Mile 9, Mile 10. I was heading east again, back toward that point where the road ended, and I couldn't seem to make myself turn around. The highway pulled me forward like a current, like I was being carried toward some destination I couldn't avoid. Madera Springs appeared ahead at mile marker 3, its lights still burning bright in the darkness. I tried to steer around it, tried to leave the highway and bypass the town entirely, but my wheel wouldn't turn. It was locked in position, refusing to respond to my input, and my rig continued straight down the main street whether I wanted it to or not. The buildings passed on either side, their lit windows showing those dark shapes standing in formation. Dozens of them now, maybe hundreds, filling every visible space. And they were all facing the street, all watching me pass, all waiting for something I couldn't predict. The diner's door stood open as I passed it. Not just unlocked, but wide open, and I could see inside clearly. The interior looked different than it had during the day. The booths were occupied now, filled with more of those dark shapes sitting in postures that suggested human customers but were somehow off, somehow wrong. They sat too straight, held themselves too still, and where their faces should have been, there was only shadow, deeper than the ambient darkness, absolute and impenetrable. One of them turned as I passed, tracking me with that faceless attention, and I saw it raise something to where its mouth should be. A coffee cup, lifting smoothly, tilting back, draining contents I couldn't see and probably didn't want to see. My truck continued through town without my input, passing the hotel and the hardware store and the post office, and I sat behind the wheel with my hands locked in a death grip and my breath coming in short gasps. The steering wheel moved on its own, making minute corrections to keep the rig centered on the street, and the accelerator held steady despite my foot lifting off completely. Something else was driving now. Something else was in control. And all I could do was watch as those buildings slid past, as those shapes watched from every window, as Highway 447 carried me east toward its ending. The town's edge appeared ahead, concrete transitioning to asphalt, and my rig picked up speed as we left the buildings behind. Mile marker 4, mile 5, mile 6, the numbers counting up with mechanical precision. The dark shapes were gone now, or at least invisible, and I was alone on the highway with nothing but stars overhead and desert on either side. My steering wheel responded to my touch again, the accelerator followed my foot, and control returned gradually, like thawing after being frozen. But I wasn't free. I understood that with terrible certainty. I was just being given enough rope, enough agency, to make my next choice feel like it was mine. The highway stretched ahead, and somewhere out there that junction with I-25 was waiting. Or wasn't, or existed in some state between real and unreal that I'd spent my whole career learning to navigate without ever acknowledging its existence. The margins of maps, the spaces between mile markers, the roads that drivers know about but don't discuss because discussing them gives them power, makes them more solid, more able to reach out and pull others in. I kept driving east because east was all there was, And ahead, just barely visible in my headlights, mile marker 23 was approaching. The point where this had all started. The point where maybe I'd find some way back to the world I knew, or where I'd learn that I'd been wrong about which world was real and which was the mirage. Either way, I was about to find out. Mile marker 23 came and went without incident. No junction appeared, no connection to exit 34B, no way back to I-25. Just more highway stretching ahead into darkness, and I'd stopped being surprised. The road wanted me to keep driving, so I kept driving. What else could I do? I had 3/4 of a tank of diesel, enough to run for another 6 or 7 hours. And after that, I'd be stranded out here with no fuel and no options. But that was a problem for future me to worry about. Present me just needed to focus on the road, on keeping the rig moving forward, on watching for whatever came next. What came next was dawn, or something like it. The eastern horizon began to lighten around what my clock claimed was 5:30 a.m., though I'd lost faith in any device's ability to track time accurately. The stars faded gradually, the sky transitioning from black to deep blue to a pale gray that suggested morning without quite achieving it. The desert around me became visible in stages, revealing landscape that looked almost normal, except for small details that were wrong. The saguaro cacti were too tall and stood in formations too regular to be natural. The mesas in the distance had angles too sharp, edges too geometric. And the road itself, Highway 447, was too straight, running without curves or deviation across terrain that should have forced some adjustment to its course. At what the GPS claimed was mile 47, I saw something ahead that made me slow down. It was a vehicle, parked on the shoulder with its emergency flashers blinking. As I got closer, I recognized it as a semi, an older freightliner with a standard box trailer, and I felt a surge of hope so intense it was painful. Another driver, another person, someone who might know the way out of here, or at least someone to share this experience with, to confirm that I wasn't going insane. I pulled up behind the freightliner, set my parking brake, and climbed out. The morning air was cool and still, carrying that same artificial smell I'd noticed in Madera Springs, clean and neutral and wrong. I approached the other truck cautiously, looking for signs of the driver. The cab was empty, door closed but not locked, and through the window I could see personal items arranged on the dashboard and passenger seat. A coffee thermos, a logbook, a road atlas similar to mine. Someone had been here recently, had been driving this rig, but where were they now? I walked around to the trailer, checking the cargo doors. They were closed and sealed, the lock intact, showing no signs of forced entry or damage. I moved to the front of the rig, thinking maybe the driver was checking the engine or dealing with some mechanical problem, but there was no one there either. Just an empty truck sitting on the shoulder of a highway that shouldn't exist, abandoned by a driver who'd left no note, no explanation, no indication of where they'd gone or why. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the desert vastness. "Anyone here?" No response. Just the whisper of wind I couldn't feel and the distant cry of a bird I couldn't see. I circled back to the cab, tried the door, and it opened easily. I climbed up on the running board and leaned inside, looking for anything that might explain the abandonment. The logbook was open to a recent date, showing entries that matched the current week. The last entry was incomplete, stopped mid-sentence. Approaching mile marker 23, GPS showing junction, but that was it. No further writing, just white space where more words should have been. I backed out of the cab and returned to my own rig, feeling the weight of isolation pressing down harder than before. That driver had been exactly where I was, had taken exit 34B and followed Highway 447 and ended up trapped in this pocket of wrong space, and they'd left their truck, had walked away into the desert for reasons I couldn't fathom, and I had the terrible certainty that I'd end up doing the same thing eventually. Not today, maybe, not while I still had fuel and hope and the ability to keep moving, but eventually, when the road offered no more forward progress, when the highway circled back to Madera Springs for the 100th time, when the only choice left was to stay in the cab and wait for whatever was waiting, or step out into the desert and walk towards something, anything, even if that something was oblivion. I kept driving, leaving the abandoned Freightliner behind, and started counting the other vehicles I passed. There were more of them than I'd initially noticed, parked at irregular intervals along the highway. Another semi at mile 53, a pickup truck at mile 61, a sedan at mile 72. Some were newer, some older, but all of them shared that same quality of recent abandonment. The pickup still had its keys in the ignition. The sedan's interior was clean and well maintained. These weren't vehicles that had been sitting here for years. They'd been left recently, by drivers who'd given up or been taken or simply ceased to exist in whatever way things cease to exist in this place. At mile 89, Highway 447 finally curved. Not dramatically, just a gentle bend to the north, but after so many miles of absolute straightness, any deviation felt significant. I followed the curve, hoping it might lead somewhere different, somewhere that wasn't another loop back to Madera Springs, and found myself climbing a gradual grade toward a ridgeline. The highway rose steadily, gaining elevation, and from the higher vantage point I could see for miles in every direction. What I saw made me stop the truck and just stare. The desert below was marked with roads, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, forming a network of highways that spread across the landscape like veins. Some were paved, some were dirt, some were little more than tracks, but they all shared certain characteristics. They were too straight, too regular, too geometric. They intersected at perfect right angles, formed grids and patterns that no natural road system would create. And at many of the intersections, I could see structures similar to Madera Springs. Small clusters of buildings with lights glowing in the morning dimness, waiting for travelers who would never leave. This wasn't just one wrong road, one mysterious exit. It was a whole network, an infrastructure that existed parallel to the real highway system, possibly underneath it or overlaid on top of it in some dimension I couldn't perceive. Exit 34B was just one entry point among many, one crack in the surface of normal reality through which drivers could slip and find themselves here, in this web of impossible roads and shadow towns. And once you were in, once you'd taken that exit and followed that GPS instruction, getting out became exponentially harder with every mile you traveled. I thought about that voice on the CB, the broken transmission warning me that none of this was real. But it was real. Just real in a different way than the world I'd come from. This place had substance, had physical presence, had rules, even if those rules didn't match the ones I'd spent my life learning. The question wasn't whether it was real. The question was whether I could find a way to leave it and return to the reality I understood, or whether I'd become another abandoned vehicle, another mystery for the next driver who stumbled into this network. The GPS still showed Highway 447 continuing ahead, still displayed my blue dot moving along that red line, still promised connection to I-25 even though I'd stopped believing that promise. But as I studied the screen more closely, I noticed something I'd missed before. The road on the GPS display was straight, running east-west with no curves or deviations. But the highway I could see through my windshield curved and twisted, following the terrain. The GPS and reality had diverged, were showing me two different versions of the same road, and I had to choose which one to trust. I chose reality, not the GPS, not the electronic navigation system that had led me here, but the physical road I could see and feel and verify with my own senses. I followed Highway 447 as it curved and climbed, ignoring the GPS's increasingly frantic suggestions to make a U-turn and return to the programmed route. The screen flickered, the display corrupted, and eventually the GPS shut down completely, the screen going dark and staying dark despite my attempts to restart it. I was navigating without instruments now, just following the physical evidence of pavement and mile markers and the fading morning light. At mile 134, the highway began to descend, dropping back down from the ridgeline into a valley I hadn't been able to see from below. And there, at the bottom of that valley, I saw something that made my breath catch. It was an exit ramp, a proper highway junction with a green sign that read, I-25 north-south, 2 miles. The road looked real, looked maintained, looked like it connected to something other than more empty desert. I approached it cautiously, watching for any signs of deception, any indication that this was just another trick, another loop that would deposit me back at Madera Springs. But the mile markers continued in proper sequence. The pavement showed normal wear patterns, and through a gap in the terrain ahead I could actually see the interstate. Could see vehicles moving along it in both directions. Could see the normal flow of traffic that represented civilization and safety, and the world I knew. I took the exit doing 50, my hands shaking on the wheel, afraid that the junction would disappear before I reached it, or transform into something else or reveal itself as a mirage. But it stayed solid, stayed real, and the ramp curved smoothly down to meet I-25 at a proper merge point. I signaled, checked my mirrors out of habit, and guided my rig onto the interstate heading south toward Las Cruces. Normal traffic surrounded me immediately, cars and other semis moving at highway speeds, nobody paying any attention to me or showing any reaction to my arrival. It was like I'd never left, like the past 12 hours hadn't happened, like Exit 34B and Highway 447 and Madera Springs had all been some extended hallucination. But they hadn't been. I knew that with absolute certainty. I'd been somewhere else, somewhere wrong, and I'd managed to find my way back. The GPS remained dark, refusing to reboot, and when I later checked it at a truck stop, a technician told me the unit's entire memory had been corrupted, wiped clean of all data including its base maps and operating system. My logbook showed impossible entries, hours that didn't add up, locations that didn't exist, and my trailer still contained the load I'd picked up in Albuquerque, untouched, exactly as it had been when I'd taken Exit 34B. I continued to Las Cruces, made my delivery on time despite the delay, and filed my paperwork without mentioning anything unusual. What would I say? That I'd spent half a day on a highway that didn't exist, driving through a town nobody had heard of, trying to escape a network of roads that couldn't be real. They'd have ordered a drug test at minimum, possibly a psych evaluation, and my career would have been over. So I kept quiet, accepted my next load assignment, and tried to forget what had happened. But I couldn't forget. And 3 weeks later, when I was checking my paper atlas to plan a route through New Mexico, I saw something that made my hands go cold. There, on the page, showing the area between Albuquerque and Las Cruces, someone had drawn a road in pencil. It was faint, barely visible, but definitely there. A line branching off from Exit 34, running east through empty desert, passing through a small dot labeled M Springs, before curving north and eventually reconnecting to I-25. The road was marked NM 447. And in the margin, in handwriting I didn't recognize but knew was somehow mine, were 3 words: never go back. I didn't remember writing that, didn't remember marking up my atlas, but the warning was clear, and I followed it. I don't drive that section of I-25 anymore, request different routes when Albuquerque to Las Cruces loads come up, and I've advised other drivers to skip exit 34 entirely, told them the ramp is in poor condition and not worth the trouble. Most ignore me, take the exit anyway because it's faster or more convenient, and most of them arrive at their destinations without incident. But every few months I hear stories. A driver who ran late for no reason, who lost time somewhere they can't explain. A GPS malfunction that showed roads that shouldn't exist. A report of an abandoned truck found on a frontage road with no explanation for why it was there or where its driver went. And I know they found exit 34B, followed Highway 447, and maybe made it back, or maybe didn't. I know that network is still there, still running parallel to the real highway system, still reaching out through corrupted GPS data and mysterious exit signs and that voice on the CB that warns you to turn around. I know Madera Springs is still waiting, its lights still burning, its coffee still hot, its shadow figures still watching for the next traveler to stumble into its streets. And I know that somewhere in my truck, probably in my logbook or my atlas or some other document I haven't checked yet, there's more evidence of that place. More proof that I was there, that it's real, that the roads we drive every day have cracks in them where the wrong kind of reality can bleed through. I'm more careful now. Triple-check my GPS before following its directions. Verify every exit against my paper maps, and I never, ever trust a route that promises to save time without showing exactly how. The margins of our maps are marked, "Here be dragons," for a reason. Because sometimes when you stray too far from the known paths, when you follow the promises of machines that think they know better than experience, you find yourself in places that don't follow our rules, don't care about our logic, and don't let you leave until they're ready to let you go, if they ever are. I still drive these roads, still haul freight across the Southwest, still pass exit 34 sometimes when my route requires it, and every time I look at that green exit sign, look for any indication of a B designation, any suggestion that the split I found that afternoon still exists. But there's never anything there. Just exit 34, clean and simple, leading to State Road 187 exactly as it should. The GPS units in other trucks show the same thing, confirm that Highway 447 doesn't exist, has never existed, is nothing more than a driver's imagination, or a mapping error, or a story told to pass the time on long hauls. But I know better. And somewhere out there in the desert east of that exit, Madera Springs is waiting. Its lights are on, its coffee is hot, and it remembers me. It always will. I've been driving solo for 19 years, and in that time I've learned that the road has two faces. There's the daylight road, predictable and mapped, where everything makes sense and follows rules you can count on. Then there's the night road, where those rules get fuzzy around the edges, where distance stretches or compresses depending on factors you can't measure, where you're never quite sure if what you're seeing is real or just exhaustion playing tricks on your brain. Most veteran drivers know this, even if they don't talk about it. We've all had nights where the miles didn't add up right, where we arrived at destinations earlier or later than physics should allow, where we saw things in our headlights that disappeared when we looked directly at them. My name is Travis Merrick, and I run heavy machinery across the northern tier states, mostly Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. It's hard country, beautiful during the day, but unforgiving at night, especially in winter when the wind comes screaming down from Canada and the temperature drops so fast you can watch it fall on your dashboard gauge. Highway 19 is one of my regular routes, a two-lane state highway that cuts through the absolute middle of nowhere, connecting small towns that exist mainly as dots on maps and brief clusters of lights in the darkness. It's the kind of road where you might not see another vehicle for an hour, where cell service is a fantasy and CB radio is your only link to the outside world. It was early February, one of those brutally cold nights where the air feels solid, where your breath freezes before it leaves your mouth and the stars overhead look like ice chips scattered across black velvet. I'd picked up a load of drilling equipment in Billings, headed for a site near the North Dakota border, and the forecast was calling for clear conditions all night. No snow, no wind, just that deep, crystalline cold that makes everything sharp and brittle. Perfect driving weather, if you dressed for it and kept your diesel flowing. I left Billings around 9 p.m., which put me on Highway 19 just before midnight. The road was empty, as expected. Just 2 lanes of asphalt cutting through rangeland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The landscape was flat here, almost perfectly level, broken only by the occasional fence line or windbreak of cottonwoods planted generations ago. My headlights reached out into that flatness, creating a cone of visibility that moved with me. And beyond that cone, there was only darkness and cold. The CB had been quiet most of the night, just the occasional burst of static or fragment of conversation from drivers too far away to hear clearly. I kept it on Channel 19 with the squelch set high, filtering out most of the noise, and I'd check in every hour or so just to confirm the channel was still working. "This is northbound on 19. Anyone out there listening?" Most times I got no response, which was fine. The silence was its own kind of company, familiar and comfortable. And I'd learned years ago that being alone didn't mean being lonely. At 2:47 a.m., I crested a low rise and saw lights ahead. Not town lights, not the stationary glow of buildings or street lamps, but moving lights. Vehicle lights. A whole string of them, maybe 6 or 7 trucks traveling in formation, their running lights creating a constellation against the darkness. I felt a small surge of relief at the sight, that primitive human response to seeing other people after hours of isolation. Company, fellow travelers, proof that I wasn't the only one crazy enough to be out here in these temperatures. I closed the distance gradually, my rig running at a steady 70, while the convoy ahead maintained maybe 65. As I got closer, I could make out more details. They were all semis, various makes and models, and they were running tight formation, maybe 100 feet between each rig. Professional spacing, the kind of interval that suggested these drivers knew each other, had driven together before, were comfortable maintaining that proximity even at highway speeds in the dark. The CB crackled as I approached, and a voice came through clear and strong. "Got a driver coming up behind us. You reading this northbound?" I grabbed the mic, keyed it, felt that familiar comfort of human contact. "Roger that. This is northbound in the Freightliner. Got you in sight. Looks like you folks are running a convoy." A different voice responded, deeper, with a slight accent I couldn't quite place. "That we are, driver. You're welcome to join up if you're headed the same direction. Safety in numbers out here." I thought about it for maybe 10 seconds before responding. Convoys were common enough, especially on these remote routes where breakdowns or weather could turn deadly fast. Having other trucks nearby meant help was available if something went wrong, meant you had someone to talk to during the long, empty hours, meant the road felt a little less vast and threatening. "Appreciate that," I transmitted. "I'm heading to the North Dakota line, probably another 3 hours out. What's your destination?" There was a pause, longer than seemed necessary for such a simple question, and when the first voice came back, something in its tone had changed. Not threatening exactly, but less welcoming, more cautious. "We're heading north as well, driver. Running through to the border and beyond. You just maintain your speed and we'll all get where we're going." The phrasing struck me as odd. That emphasis on where we're going, like it meant something more than just a physical destination. But I was tired, Had been driving for 5 hours already, and odd phrasings happen all the time on CB radio. People get creative with language when they spend enough time alone. I settled in behind the last truck in the convoy, a Peterbilt with a standard box trailer, and matched their speed. The formation absorbed me smoothly, and I felt myself relaxing into the rhythm of group travel. The taillights ahead provided a focal point, something to track besides the empty road, and knowing there were other drivers nearby made the night feel less oppressive. We drove in silence for maybe 20 minutes, just the hum of tires and the distant growl of diesel engines, and I started to notice details about the trucks I was following. The Peterbilt's trailer had no markings, no company name or logo, just plain white paint that looked gray in my headlights. That wasn't unusual in itself. Plenty of owner-operators ran unmarked equipment, but something about the complete absence of identification felt deliberate. I looked ahead at the other trucks in the convoy, squinting to make out details in the darkness, and realized they were all the same. No company markings, no DOT numbers visible, no mud flaps with customary slogans or chrome accessories that drivers use to personalize their rigs. They were anonymous, stripped of the individual identity that most truckers prided themselves on. The CB crackled again, and this time it was a woman's voice, younger, with a slight southern drawl. "How's everyone doing out there? Staying warm?" Responses came from multiple drivers, a chorus of affirmations and brief comments about the weather. I counted 5 distinct voices, which matched the number of trucks I could see ahead of me, not including my own rig. "Cold as a well-digger's backside," one voice said, getting a few chuckles in response. "But we're making good time, should hit the next waypoint right on schedule." Waypoint, another odd choice of words. Truckers usually talked about towns or truck stops or specific mile markers, not waypoints. That was navigation terminology, the kind of language pilots used, or maybe military convoys. But again, I dismissed it as personal preference, individual style, nothing worth worrying about. I keyed my mic, added my own voice to the conversation. "Running warm here, heaters keeping up just fine. Appreciate the company out here, been a quiet night." The woman's voice came back immediately. "We're glad to have you, driver. It's good to have a full complement again. Been running one short for too long." I frowned at that, not sure what she meant by full complement, or why it would matter how many trucks were in the convoy. But before I could ask, one of the male voices cut in with a question about road conditions ahead, and the conversation shifted to more practical matters. We drove through the early morning hours, that dead time between midnight and dawn, when the world feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for something to break the spell. The highway remained empty except for our convoy, no oncoming traffic, no vehicles passing in either direction, just our 7 rigs moving north through the darkness. The CB chatter continued sporadically, brief exchanges about weather and road conditions, and the eternal trucker complaints about fuel prices and dispatch schedules. Normal conversation, familiar rhythms, nothing that raised any immediate concerns. But gradually I started to notice things that didn't quite add up. The convoy maintained absolutely perfect spacing, never varying by more than a few feet, even when the road curved or dipped. The trucks ahead never seemed to brake, never showed brake lights even when cresting hills or approaching curves. And their exhaust, visible as faint plumes in my headlights when the cold air hit the hot diesel emissions, looked wrong somehow. Too thin, too translucent, not the thick white clouds I'd expect in these temperatures. At 3:15 a.m., the lead truck called back on the CB. "Got weather coming in from the northwest. Looks like fog or maybe snow. Everyone stay sharp." I checked my mirrors instinctively, looking for signs of the approaching weather, but the sky behind me was clear, stars visible and bright. I looked ahead and saw nothing but the taillights of the convoy, no indication of any weather front. But the lead driver had presumably been watching their forecast, or maybe had better visibility from their position. So I acknowledged the warning and tightened my grip on the wheel. The fog appeared suddenly, without the gradual buildup you'd normally expect. One moment, the road ahead was clear. The next, it was filled with white mist so thick I could barely see the Peterbilt's taillights 50 feet ahead of me. I slowed instinctively, dropping from 70 to 60 to 50, and the convoy slowed with me, maintaining that same perfect spacing. The fog had a strange quality to it, almost luminous, lit from within by some light source I couldn't identify. It flowed across the highway in patterns that seemed purposeful, almost choreographed, and it made no sound. No wind, no moisture hitting my windshield, just that silent white presence surrounding us. "Everyone stay in formation," the lead driver transmitted, his voice calm but authoritative. "Don't break away, don't try to pass. We stay together through this." The other drivers acknowledged in sequence, their voices coming through the fog like they were speaking from very far away, and I added my own confirmation. The fog grew thicker, reducing visibility to maybe 30 feet, then 20, then just the faint red glow of the taillights ahead. I focused on those lights, used them as my anchor, trusting that the convoy knew this road, knew how to navigate these conditions. That's when I noticed the mile markers had stopped appearing. We'd been passing them at regular intervals all night, the small green signs marking our progress north, but I hadn't seen one in several minutes. I watched the roadside carefully, looking for that familiar reflective material, but saw only fog and darkness. The highway itself remained visible, a ribbon of darker gray cutting through the white, but everything else had disappeared. The fence lines, the occasional ranch gate, the distant lights of farmhouses, all gone. Just road and fog and the convoy ahead. The CB conversation had stopped completely, all the chatter falling away into silence. I tried calling out, asking if everyone was still there, if everyone could still see the road. No response. The channel was open. I could hear the faint hiss of static, but no voices came through. I was about to try again when the lead driver's voice cut through, but he wasn't talking to me. He was talking to someone else, someone I couldn't hear. "Confirmed, we're at the crossing point. Beginning transition now. All units maintain speed and heading." Crossing point? Transition? I keyed my mic, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Lead driver. What crossing point? What are you talking about?" Silence. Then the woman's voice, that same southern drawl, but colder now, more distant. "Just stay with us, driver. You're one of us now. You've always been one of us. You just didn't know it yet." The words made no sense, raised questions I didn't want to ask, and I felt the first real stirring of fear in my chest. Something was wrong here. Something had been wrong all along, and I'd been too tired or too trusting or too desperate for company to notice. I eased off the accelerator, letting my rig slow down, trying to put some distance between myself and the Peterbilt ahead. But the Peterbilt slowed too, matching my speed exactly, maintaining that same interval. I tried to change lanes, to pull around and break away from the convoy, but when I turned the wheel, nothing happened. The rig continued straight, following the road, following the convoy, and my steering input made no difference. It was like driving on ice, but the road surface was dry and my tires should have had full traction. The fog began to pulse then, expanding and contracting in rhythm with something I couldn't hear but could feel in my chest. A deep, subsonic vibration that made my ribs ache. The convoy's taillights flickered in sync with those pulses, and through the fog I started to see shapes, suggestions of structures or objects that appeared and disappeared before I could focus on them. They looked almost like signs, Huge overhead structures that shouldn't exist on a two-lane highway, covered with text I couldn't read and languages I didn't recognize. "Let me out," I transmitted, not caring how it sounded, not caring about protocol or radio etiquette. "I'm breaking off, heading back south. This isn't right." The lead driver's response came immediately, and this time there was something almost like sympathy in his voice. "Can't do that, driver. You took the invitation, you joined the convoy. We're all going to the same place now. Whether we knew we were headed there or not, just relax. It's easier if you don't fight it." I tried the brakes, stood on them as hard as I could, felt the cab pitch forward as the air system engaged, heard the hiss of releasing pressure. But the rig didn't slow down. The speedometer held steady at 50, and the convoy maintained its formation, and the fog continued to pulse around us like we were traveling through the breathing throat of something vast and alive. I was trapped, locked into this procession, being carried toward a destination I hadn't chosen and couldn't see, and the only other people who might help were the same people who trapped me here in the first place. The fog began to clear ahead, not gradually, but suddenly, like passing through a curtain. One moment we were surrounded by white mist, the next we were in clear air under a sky full of stars. But the stars were wrong, configured in patterns I didn't recognize, forming constellations that shouldn't exist. And the road ahead, the highway we'd been following, had changed. It was wider now, 4 lanes instead of 2, and the pavement looked different, darker, almost black, with markings in colors I'd never seen on any highway. The convoy continued without hesitation, the trucks ahead spreading out to fill the wider road, and I had no choice but to follow. The highway stretched ahead like a wound in the landscape, that dark pavement absorbing light instead of reflecting it, and the mile markers that began to appear were marked with symbols instead of numbers. Not letters, not pictographs, just geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to writhe and reconfigure themselves when I tried to focus on them. The convoy spread across all 4 lanes now, no longer in single file but in a staggered formation, and I found myself in the left lane with trucks on both sides, boxing me in completely. The temperature gauge on my dash started to fluctuate, jumping from 180 degrees to 240 and back to 160 in the span of seconds. My fuel gauge did the same, showing 3/4 full, then nearly empty, then full again. The clock had stopped at 3:33 a.m., the numbers frozen on the display, and when I tried to check my phone, the screen showed nothing but static, gray noise that moved like insects. Every system in the cab was malfunctioning, giving me contradictory information, making it impossible to know anything for certain except that I was still moving, and the convoy was still around me. The CB came to life again, but this time it wasn't any of the voices I'd heard before. This was something else, a layered sound like multiple people speaking in unison, their words overlapping but somehow remaining distinct. "Welcome to the northern route, driver. You've been selected for continuation. Your previous designation has been suspended. You are now part of the permanent convoy." The words made my skin crawl, not just because of their content but because of the way they were delivered, that mechanical precision that suggested the speakers weren't quite human, or had forgotten how to sound human after too long away from regular human contact. "I didn't agree to this," I transmitted back, my voice tight with fear and anger. "Let me go. I have a delivery to make, people expecting me. You can't just—" The unified voice cut me off. "Your previous obligations are no longer relevant. The delivery you speak of will never arrive. The people expecting you will gradually forget you were coming. Time operates differently here. You'll understand soon." The casual way they dismissed my entire existence, my job, my identity, made something in me snap. I started yanking on the steering wheel, trying to force the rig to respond, trying to break free of whatever was controlling it. Nothing changed. The rig continued on its course, tracking that dark highway with mechanical precision, and my efforts to control it had no effect whatsoever. I was a passenger in my own truck, watching helplessly as I was carried deeper into wherever this road led. The other trucks in the convoy maintained their positions around me, creating a shell of metal in motion that I couldn't penetrate, couldn't escape. Through their windows, I could see the silhouettes of drivers, or things that looked like drivers, sitting perfectly still behind their wheels, not moving, not adjusting their positions, just maintaining that same rigid posture hour after hour. The landscape outside had changed completely. We weren't in Montana anymore, or anywhere I recognized. The terrain was too flat, stretching to the horizon without variation, and the color was wrong. Not quite gray, not quite brown, but some shade in between that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on it. There were structures scattered across this landscape, buildings or towers or something else, all of them the same vague shape, all of them equidistant from the highway, arranged in patterns too regular to be natural. They looked like they were made of the same material as the road, that light-absorbing darkness, and they cast shadows that fell in multiple directions simultaneously, suggesting multiple light sources or physics that didn't match Earth's. I tried the door handle, thinking maybe I could climb out while the rig was moving, could throw myself from the cab and take my chances with the fall rather than continue on this journey. But the door wouldn't open. Not locked, just sealed, like the handle was welded in place or the door had merged with the frame. The windows wouldn't open either, and when I looked closely at the glass, I realized it wasn't glass anymore. It was something else, something crystalline, and it distorted the view outside in subtle ways, making distances impossible to judge and shapes hard to define. The woman's voice came through the CB again, that southern drawl more pronounced now, almost exaggerated. "I know what you're thinking, sugar. Thinking maybe you can jump ship, make a break for it. But there's nowhere to go out there. That landscape you're seeing, it's not real. It's interface territory, the space between where you were and where you're going. You step out into that, you'll just keep falling forever, or stop existing, or both. Better to stay in the cab. At least in here, you're still something." "What are you?" I asked, abandoning any pretense of normal conversation. "What is this convoy? Where are we going?" A different voice answered, one of the male voices from earlier, but with that same unified quality, like he was speaking for all of them simultaneously. "We're drivers, same as you. Or we used to be. We took this route long enough that it stopped being temporary and became permanent. Now we run it continuously, picking up new additions when the road decides it needs them. As for where we're going, that's complicated. The road loops, you see. It goes north forever, but it also comes back around, intersects with itself at certain points. We're heading toward one of those intersection points now." The trucks ahead started to slow down, their speed dropping from 50 to 40 to 30, and the convoy tightened formation, the intervals between rigs shrinking until we were almost bumper to bumper. I could see the driver in the Peterbilt ahead more clearly now, and what I saw made my stomach clench. It was a person, or had been once, but their skin had the same dark quality as the pavement, like they were slowly becoming part of the road itself. Their hands on the wheel were too thin, the bones visible through translucent flesh, and their neck bent at an angle that should have been impossible. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you been out here?" The woman laughed, but it was a sad sound, empty of real humor. Long enough that time stopped meaning anything. Could be years, could be decades. Hard to say when there's no day or night, no seasons, no reference points. We measure time in routes now, and the number of loops we complete. I'm at 342. Some of the others are in the thousands. The lead driver, the one who invited you in, he's been here so long he's forgotten his name. Forgotten everything except the route. I felt something break inside me then. Some fundamental belief in the solidity of reality, the permanence of self. If what she was saying was true, if drivers could get trapped on this road for decades or centuries, gradually losing their humanity until they became living parts of the highway infrastructure, then I was already dead. My old life was over, and what remained was just the slow dissolution of identity, the gradual transformation into something that existed only to drive, to maintain this convoy, to perpetuate the road. But I wasn't ready to accept that. Not yet. I started going through everything in the cab, looking for anything that might help, any tool or resource I'd forgotten about. My phone was useless, just static and noise. My logbook showed entries that made no sense. Dates from years ago mixed with dates from the future. Locations that didn't exist. My atlas, that old paper backup I'd relied on for so long, showed only blank pages the maps faded or erased or never printed in the first place. But in the glove box, buried under old receipts and repair records, I found something I'd forgotten about. A GPS unit, an old one I'd stopped using years ago when I'd upgraded to the newer model mounted on my dash. I pulled it out, checked the battery. Dead. But it had a power cable, and I plugged it into the cigarette lighter, held my breath while it booted up. The screen flickered, showed the manufacturer's logo, and then displayed a map. For a moment, I felt hope surge in my chest. But then I looked at what the map was showing, and that hope died. The GPS showed my position as a blue dot on a black background, with no roads, no landmarks, no indication of where I was. Just that dot, moving slowly north through emptiness. And in the corner of the screen, where it should have shown my speed and direction, there was just a single word: transitioning. The convoy came to a complete stop then, all 7 trucks halting simultaneously without any brake lights showing, without any warning. We were parked on the dark highway in perfect formation, engines idling but nobody moving, and through my windows I could see something ahead that made my breath catch. It was a structure, or something like a structure, rising from the road surface like it had grown there organically. It looked almost like a toll booth, but impossibly tall and wide, spanning all 4 lanes and extending upward until it disappeared into the darkness overhead. And it was covered with those same geometric symbols I'd seen on the mile markers, thousands of them, all glowing with a faint blue light that pulsed in that same rhythm I'd felt earlier. "Checkpoint," the lead driver transmitted. "Everyone stay in your cabs. The scan takes a few minutes, but it's necessary. They need to verify we're all still viable, still capable of continuing the route. Stay calm, and it'll be over quick." The way he said viable made my skin crawl. Like we were cargo being inspected, or livestock being evaluated, not people with autonomy and rights and the ability to choose our own destinations. The structure began to emit a sound, so low it was almost below the threshold of hearing, a vibration that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. I felt something sweep across the cab, invisible but tangible, like a wave of pressure or a change in air density. It passed through me, through the metal and glass of the truck, and I had the distinct sensation of being read, being analyzed, having my fundamental properties cataloged by whatever intelligence operated this checkpoint. The GPS screen went crazy, cycling through different displays so fast I couldn't track them, showing maps of places I'd never been, coordinates that included numbers I didn't recognize, altitudes that were either impossibly high or impossibly low, or possibly both. Then it stopped. The scanning beam, or whatever it was, passed, moving on to the truck behind me, and the structure's symbols dimmed slightly. The lead driver's voice came through the CB, and there was something like relief in his tone. "All clear. We're approved for continuation. Everyone prepare to resume. Next stop is the depot, about 2 hours out at current speed. We'll offload there, take on new cargo, and start the next loop." 2 hours. 2 more hours trapped in this convoy, traveling deeper into whatever this place was, getting further from any hope of return. I couldn't do it. Couldn't accept it. Wouldn't sit here passively and let myself be transformed into one of those hollow drivers who measured time in loops and forgot their own names. I looked at my door handle, at that sealed exit, and made a decision. If I couldn't open the door normally, I'd break the window. I grabbed my tire iron from behind the seat, raised it to strike the crystalline glass, and that's when the woman's voice stopped me. "Don't," she said. And this time there was genuine urgency in her tone. "Please don't. You break that window. The pressure differential will kill you before you can jump. The atmosphere out there isn't the same as in your cab. We're not in baseline reality anymore. We're in the adjacent space and the physics don't translate. You'd dissolve before you hit the ground. Just come apart at the molecular level. I've seen it happen before. Please, just stay inside." I lowered the tire iron, my hands shaking, and stared out at that alien landscape. "Then what?" I said to the CB, not caring if anyone else heard. "I just accept this? Become like you? Like all of you? Drive this route until I forget who I was?" The woman was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost kind. "No. There might be another way. The depot we're heading to, it's a junction point. The route intersects with baseline reality there, just for a few minutes while we're loading and unloading. If you're fast, if you're lucky, you might be able to slip through before the intersection closes, but you have to wait. You have to make it to the depot first." "And if I don't make it through?" I asked. "If the intersection closes before I can escape?" She didn't answer immediately, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. If I missed that window, if I didn't make it through before the junction point closed, I'd be trapped here permanently. No more chances, no more options. Just the route, the convoy, the endless loops through impossible space. I had one shot, and I couldn't afford to miss it. The convoy started moving again, engines revving in perfect synchronization, and we pulled away from the checkpoint structure. I watched it recede in my mirrors, those glowing symbols fading into the distance, and tried to prepare myself for what came next. 2 hours, 120 minutes to stay alert, stay focused, stay ready for whatever opportunity might present itself at the depot. I checked the old GPS unit, but it had gone dark again, the screen blank despite still being plugged in. I tried to remember everything I knew about pressure differentials and atmospheric composition, about molecular structures and baseline reality, trying to understand what the woman had meant, what dangers I'd face if I tried to escape at the wrong moment. The dark highway continued ahead, and the convoy maintained its formation, and I drove north through emptiness with only the promise of a maybe escape to hold on to. Behind me, in my mirrors, I could see the checkpoint structure still glowing, much farther away than it should have been given how recently we'd left it. And beyond that structure in the far distance, I thought I saw more lights, more checkpoints, or other convoys, or things I couldn't name and didn't want to understand. This road was bigger than I'd imagined, more populated. A whole network of impossible routes carrying freight and drivers through spaces that shouldn't exist. And somewhere ahead, according to the woman's warning, was a depot, a loading facility that existed in both this impossible space and baseline reality simultaneously. a junction point where the route touched the normal world for just a few minutes before pulling away again. That was my chance. My only chance. And I had 2 hours to prepare for it, to figure out how to recognize the moment when it came, how to move fast enough to escape before the opportunity closed. 2 hours to hold on to hope and sanity and the belief that escape was possible. 2 hours to stay myself, to avoid becoming like the hollow drivers around me who'd long ago given up any thought of return. The convoy drove on, and I drove with it, and ahead, somewhere in the darkness, a depot was waiting. A door back to the world. And I'd either make it through or I wouldn't, but at least I'd try. At least I'd fight until the last possible moment, because I was still Travis Merrick, still a person with a name and a history and a life waiting for me, and I wouldn't let this road take that away without a fight. The landscape began to change as we approached what the woman had called the depot. The flat, colorless expanse gave way to structures, industrial buildings or warehouse complexes that lined both sides of the highway. They looked almost normal from a distance, like the kind of freight facilities you'd see near any major interstate. But as we got closer, I could see the wrongness in them. They were too symmetrical, too perfect, with walls that seemed to be made from the same material as the highway, that same light-absorbing darkness. And they had no doors, or rather their doors were just darker patches in already dark walls, openings that led to interiors I couldn't see into and didn't want to explore. The convoy slowed to 30, then 20, navigating through what appeared to be an access road system, multiple lanes branching off from the main highway like capillaries from an artery. I could see other vehicles now, not just semis but other trucks too, smaller box trucks and vans and things that didn't quite match any vehicle I'd seen before, all moving in the same orderly patterns, all following invisible traffic rules. And there were people, or shapes that looked like people, standing near some of the buildings, watching the convoy pass. They didn't wave or acknowledge us, just stood there with that same rigid stillness I'd seen in the other drivers, and I couldn't tell if they were waiting for something or had been standing there forever. "Approaching Depot 12, the lead driver transmitted. "All units prepare for standard offload procedure. New driver, you stay with the Peterbilt in front of you, don't break formation until we're in the loading area. Understood?" I keyed my mic to acknowledge, my hands sweating despite the cold, my heart hammering in my chest. This was it. The junction point was coming, and I needed to be ready to move the instant I saw an opening. But I had no idea what I was looking for, no way to identify the moment when the depot touched baseline reality. The woman's voice came through on what must have been a private channel, lower, meant just for me. "Listen carefully, sugar. When we pull into the loading area, you're going to see 2 sets of structures. One set will look like these buildings around us, dark and wrong. The other set will look normal, like regular warehouses with concrete walls and overhead doors. That second set is the baseline intersection. You'll only see it for maybe 5 minutes, maybe less. When you see it, when you can make out details like security lights or paint colors or diode markings, that's when you run. Get out of your cab, get to those normal buildings, and get inside before the intersection closes." "How will I know when it's closing?" I asked, keeping my voice low even though I wasn't sure if the others could hear me. "There'll be a sound," she said. "Like wind chimes, but deeper, almost painful. When you hear that, you've got maybe 30 seconds before the intersection seals and you're stuck here for another full loop. Don't hesitate, don't look back, just run. And if anyone tries to stop you, don't let them. Some of the others, they've been here so long they don't want anyone to escape, don't want to be reminded that leaving is even possible." The convoy turned into a wide parking area, pulling into designated spaces with that same mechanical precision. I followed the Peterbilt ahead of me, parking parallel to it, and killed my engine like the others were doing. The sudden silence was jarring after hours of diesel rumble, and I sat there for a moment trying to calm my racing heart, trying to prepare myself for whatever came next. Through my window, I could see the loading docks, and just like the woman had described, there were two sets of structures occupying the same space. One was dark and impossible, warehouse walls that hurt to look at. The other was faint, translucent, like a double-exposed photograph, but definitely normal, definitely real. I watched that double image, waiting for the baseline structures to solidify, to become clear enough that I could make out details. Seconds crawled by like hours. The other drivers were climbing out of their cabs now, moving toward the loading docks in a line, and I could see them more clearly now that we were stationary. They looked human from a distance, but up close, the wrongness was obvious. Their movements were too smooth, too mechanical, and their skin had that same dark translucence I'd noticed in the Peterbilt driver earlier. They weren't people anymore, or they were people in the process of becoming something else, something adapted to this impossible space. The baseline structures grew more solid, more defined. I could see overhead lights now, sodium vapor lamps casting orange glows. I could see loading dock numbers stenciled on doors. I could see a normal concrete parking lot with painted lines and oil stains and all the mundane details that proved this was real. This was Earth. This was my chance. I grabbed my keys, checked that my wallet and phone were in my pockets, and reached for the door handle. Please open, I thought. Please let me out. The handle turned, the door opened, and the rush of cold air that hit me was normal air, February air from Montana or somewhere near it, carrying the smell of diesel and asphalt and winter. I climbed down from the cab, my boots hitting solid pavement, and I could feel the difference immediately. This was real gravity, real atmosphere, real physics. I was back in baseline reality, or at least touching it, and I had maybe 5 minutes to get fully across that threshold before the intersection closed and took the opportunity with it. I started walking toward the normal structures, trying to look casual, trying not to draw attention. The other drivers were busy with their loading procedures, moving between the trucks and the impossible warehouses, and most of them ignored me. But I felt eyes on me, felt attention tracking my movement, and when I glanced back I saw one of the drivers had stopped working and was watching me directly. It was the lead driver, the one who'd been running this convoy long enough to forget his name, and even from a distance I could see the expression on his face. Not anger, not surprise, just resignation. He knew what I was doing, and he wasn't going to stop me. Maybe he even wanted me to succeed, wanted to know that escape was still possible, even if it was too late for him. I picked up my pace, moving from a walk to a jog, heading for the nearest normal-looking warehouse. The building had a sign, Mountain States Distribution, Bay 4, and there was a regular metal door next to the loading dock, the kind with a crash bar and a safety window, real, solid, my escape route. I was maybe 50 yards away when I heard the sound the woman had warned me about. Not wind chimes exactly, but close, a crystalline ringing that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and it was accompanied by a feeling of pressure, like the air was getting thicker, harder to move through. I ran, flat out, sprinting across the pavement, my breath burning in my lungs, my boots pounding on concrete. Behind me, I heard shouts, voices calling for me to stop, to come back, but I didn't look. I focused on that door, on the crash bar and safety glass, on the normal world beyond it. 30 yards, 20. The ringing grew louder, more insistent, and I felt the baseline structures starting to fade, starting to lose solidity. The building ahead was becoming translucent again, its details blurring, and I knew I had seconds left, maybe less. I hit the door at full speed, slamming into the crash bar with my shoulder, and felt it give. The door swung open, and I stumbled through into darkness. into what felt like a storage room or utility closet, and I spun around to see the parking lot outside. The impossible structures were becoming more solid, more real, while the baseline buildings faded. I could see the convoy drivers standing in formation, watching the doorway I'd come through, and one of them, maybe the woman who'd helped me, raised a hand in what might have been a wave or a farewell. Then the intersection closed completely, the ringing stopped, and I was looking at a normal warehouse wall with the normal cinder block construction and normal graffiti tags. I stood there gasping, my hands on my knees, waiting for my heart to slow down. The room around me was exactly what it appeared to be: a utility closet in a warehouse, full of cleaning supplies and broken pallets and all the mundane debris of normal industrial operations. There was a light switch by the door, and when I flipped it, fluorescent tubes buzzed to life overhead, revealing a completely ordinary space. No darkness that absorbed light, no geometric symbols, no alien physics. Just a normal room in a normal building in what I hoped was normal Montana. I found another door leading deeper into the warehouse, pushed through it, and emerged into a main floor area full of shipping containers and forklifts and workers in reflective vests. Real workers, real people, who glanced at me briefly before going back to their tasks. Nobody seemed surprised to see me. Nobody questioned why I'd come out of a utility closet instead of through the main entrance. I was just another person in a busy warehouse, unremarkable and uninteresting, and that anonymity felt like the greatest blessing I'd ever received. I made my way to the front office, found a receptionist who directed me to a phone I could use. I called my dispatcher, expecting to have to explain where I'd been, why I'd missed my delivery schedule, why I'd disappeared for what must have been hours or days. But the dispatcher didn't seem concerned. "Travis, yeah, you're right on schedule. Deliveries not until tomorrow afternoon. You're making good time. What do you need?" I checked the calendar on her desk. It showed the same date as when I'd left Billings, maybe 6 hours later. No days lost, no time missing. Like the hours I'd spent in that convoy had never happened, had taken place in some parallel duration that didn't affect baseline timeline. I made an excuse about needing to check my rig, about possible mechanical issues, and asked where I could find the parking area. The receptionist gave me directions, led me to a window that overlooked the warehouse's truck lot, and there it was. My Freightliner, parked exactly where I must have left it before. Before what? Before entering the impossible depot? Before getting caught by the convoy? I couldn't make sense of the timeline, couldn't reconcile my memories with what the calendar and dispatcher were telling me. But my truck was there, solid and real, and when I went out to inspect it, everything was normal. The load was secure, the engine was cold like it had been parked for a while, and my logbook showed the last entry from Billings with nothing unusual noted. I climbed into the cab, sat in the driver's seat, and tried to process what had happened. Had it been real? Had I actually driven with that phantom convoy through impossible space? Or had I fallen asleep at the wheel somewhere and dreamed the entire experience? But my clothes smelled like that artificial cleanness from the other place, and when I checked my old GPS unit, the one I'd plugged in during the convoy, its memory had been completely wiped. Not just erased, but corrupted at a hardware level, showing error codes the manufacturer probably didn't know existed. I stayed in that warehouse parking lot for the rest of the day, and all of that night, too shaken to continue driving, too afraid I'd somehow slip back onto that dark highway if I left the safety of normal space. Other trucks came and went, drivers moving through their routes with easy confidence, and I envied their certainty, their belief that roads only went where maps said they went. I knew different now, knew there were other routes running parallel to ours, roads that could reach out and pull you in if you weren't careful, if you weren't paying attention, if you happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The next morning, I completed my delivery without incident, dropped my load at the designated site near the North Dakota border, and started the drive back to Billings. I took the interstate the entire way, stuck to I-94 and I-90, refused to use any secondary highways or shortcuts even when they would have saved time. Highway 19 appeared on the signs a few times, exit ramps offering access to that two-lane state road, but I passed them by without slowing down. I'd never drive that route again, never take the risk that whatever had happened before might happen again. But 2 days after returning to Billings, while I was at home trying to sleep in my own bed, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was the CB radio in my truck, still parked outside in the driveway, and it shouldn't have been on. I'd turned everything off before leaving the cab, had checked all the switches, had even disconnected the battery to prevent any drain. But I could hear it through my open window, that familiar hiss of static, and underneath the static, faint but distinct, voices. The voices from the convoy. Maintain formation. Next loop begins at 0300. New driver still hasn't returned. I ran outside in my bare feet, yanked open the driver's door, and stared at the CB unit. It was off. The power switch was in the off position. The battery was disconnected, but the screen was glowing faintly, and the speaker was producing sound. I grabbed a wrench from my toolbox and started to disconnect the entire unit, to physically remove it from the dash. But before I could get the mounting bolts loose, the woman's voice came through. That southern drawl, unmistakable. "Hey, sugar, just wanted to check in, make sure you made it all the way back. Some drivers, they think they've escaped, but they're really just in between loops. The route has a way of calling you back. You hear it yet? That pull to get back on the road at night, to take the long way, to see what's out there in the empty places?" I ripped the CB unit free, tearing wires, breaking connectors, and threw it as hard as I could across the yard. It hit the fence, broke into pieces, and went silent. But the damage was done. The seeds of doubt were planted, because I did feel it, that pull she'd described. Every night when I tried to sleep, I thought about those empty highways, about the convoy running its eternal loop, about the drivers who'd become so integrated with the route they'd forgotten they'd ever been human. And a part of me, a part I didn't want to acknowledge, wondered what it would be like to just give in, to join them, to stop fighting, and let the road carry me wherever it wanted to go. 3 years have passed since that night with the convoy. 3 years of driving during daylight hours only, of avoiding Highway 19 and any other secondary routes that might connect to whatever network those impossible roads form. 3 years of checking and rechecking my equipment, of replacing GPS units that start showing routes that don't exist, of disconnecting CB radios the moment they begin picking up transmissions from drivers who shouldn't be there. 3 years of trying to convince myself that I'm safe, that I escaped completely, that the convoy can't reach me anymore. But I know it's a lie. I know they're still out there, still running their loops through spaces adjacent to our reality, still carrying whatever cargo the depot loads them with. And I know they're waiting for me to make a mistake, to let my guard down, to take one wrong turn on one dark night and find myself back on that dark highway with those hollow drivers and that pull toward the destinations I can't name. The evidence is everywhere once you know to look for it. Other drivers going missing, last reported on remote highways before vanishing completely. Trucks found abandoned with their engines still running, their logbooks showing impossible routes. CB chatter in the deep hours of the morning. Voices that overlap and echo, like they're speaking from very far away or very long ago. The road has teeth, the old-timers used to say, and I never understood what they meant until I felt those teeth close around me, until I struggled free and found myself marked by the experience. I tried to warn people at first, told other drivers about the convoy, about Highway 19, about the danger of accepting invitations to join up with trucks you don't recognize. Most ignored me, dismissed it as road fatigue or too much time alone. A few listened with the polite attention you give to someone who's clearly suffering from stress, nodding along before finding excuses to end the conversation. But one driver, an older man named Hank who'd been running these routes longer than I'd been alive, pulled me aside after I'd shared my story at a truck stop outside of Great Falls. "You're not crazy," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure nobody else was listening. "I've heard similar stories from other drivers over the years. Different details, different roads, but the same basic pattern. Something out there in the empty spaces, something that uses the highways as its hunting ground. Most folks who encounter it don't come back. The fact that you did, that you got away, that's remarkable. But it also means you're marked. They know you now, know your face, your voice, your rig, and they'll be patient. They've got all the time in the world." I asked him if he knew any way to protect myself, any method to keep from being pulled back onto those impossible routes. He shook his head slowly. "Only thing I can tell you is what an old driver told me 30 years ago. Stay in the light. Don't drive at night unless you absolutely have to. Don't trust your GPS if it shows routes you don't recognize. And most importantly, don't ever, ever drive alone on secondary highways after midnight. That's when they're strongest, when the boundary between their roads and ours gets thin enough to cross." I've followed that advice as much as I can, but it's getting harder. The pull toward night driving gets stronger every month, like an itch I can't scratch, a hunger I can't satisfy. I find myself planning routes that would take me past Highway 19, thinking about what might happen if I just took that turn, just drove north one more time, just answered the call I feel building in my bones. It would be so easy, so simple. Just turn the wheel and let the road carry me back to the convoy, back to the eternal loop, back to a kind of certainty that exists nowhere else in this uncertain world. Last night, I had a dream. Or maybe it wasn't a dream. Maybe it was something else, some kind of transmission from that other space. I was driving north on Highway 19, following the same route as that first night, and ahead of me I saw the lights of the convoy. They were waiting for me at the exact same spot where I'd first encountered them, running in perfect formation, and as I got closer I could hear their voices on the CB. Not the mechanical unified voice from the depot, but their individual voices. The drivers I'd briefly known. The woman with her southern drawl, the lead driver with his authoritative tone, all of them calling to me, welcoming me back, telling me there was still a place for me in the formation. And the worst part, the part that terrifies me most, is that I wanted to join them. In the dream, I accelerated, closed the distance, slid into formation like I'd never left. The relief I felt was overwhelming, like coming home after a long journey, like finding the place I was always meant to be. We drove together through the night, through the fog and into that other space, and it felt right in ways I can't explain. Natural, inevitable. Like I'd only been delaying the inevitable during these 3 years, like escape was never really an option, just a temporary reprieve. I woke up with my hand on my keys, my truck keys, and I was standing by my rig in the middle of the night with no memory of getting out of bed or getting dressed or walking outside. I'd been about to climb into the cab, about to start the engine and drive somewhere, though I couldn't remember where I'd been planning to go. The pull toward the convoy is getting stronger. I don't know how much longer I can resist it. Today, I accepted a load that will take me through northern Montana, a route that comes within 50 miles of Highway 19. I told myself I'm just being practical, that this is good money and I can't afford to keep turning down work. But deep down, I know the truth. I'm going back. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. I'll find a reason to take that turn, to drive north on that two-lane highway, to be out there at 2:47 a.m. when the convoy appears. And when they invite me to join them again, when they welcome me back into formation, I don't think I'll refuse. Because the thing about that convoy, the thing I haven't told anyone, is that it wasn't just terrifying. It was also peaceful. There was certainty there, a sense of purpose, a role to fill in a pattern larger than myself. No more decisions about routes or schedules or whether to accept this load or that one. Just the road, the formation, the eternal loop. And after 19 years of driving solo, of making every choice myself, of carrying the weight of independence and freedom, that certainty looks less like a prison and more like relief. The CB unit I installed to replace the one I destroyed has started picking up signals again. Nothing clear, just fragments of conversation in those familiar voices, coming through strongest in the hours just before dawn. Running smooth tonight. Schedule maintained. 7 trucks in formation. That last one makes me pause every time. 7 trucks. There's still one short of a full complement. Still waiting for someone to fill that empty position. Still waiting for me. I've stopped fighting the pull. Stopped trying to convince myself that I can maintain this half-life indefinitely, driving only in daylight, avoiding the routes I know best, keeping myself isolated from the very thing that defines me. I'm a trucker, I drive, and the convoy needs a driver, simple as that. Maybe it was always going to end this way. Maybe taking exit 34B or joining that convoy on Highway 19 wasn't a random occurrence, but an invitation I'd been selected for, a calling I'd been avoiding. And maybe the real mistake wasn't accepting the invitation, but trying to refuse it, trying to go back to normal life after seeing what I saw, knowing what I know. Tonight, I'm loading out for that run through Montana. The route will take me within sight of Highway 19 around 2 a.m., assuming I maintain my current schedule. I could stop earlier, could pull into a truck stop and wait for dawn like I've done dozens of times before. But I won't. I know I won't. Because when I pass that exit, when I see the sign for Highway 19, I'm going to take it. I'm going to drive north into the darkness, and at 2:47 a.m., I'm going to see those lights ahead. That convoy running in perfect formation. And this time, when they welcome me back, when they open a space in their line for my rig, I'm going to accept. Maybe this makes me weak. Maybe I'm giving up on everything I built in my life before the convoy. But that life doesn't feel real anymore. Hasn't felt real since the night I escaped through that depot junction. This life, these 3 years of fighting and resisting and pretending I could go back to normal, it's been the dream. The convoy is reality. The route is real. And I'm ready to stop running from what I've known all along was inevitable. If you're reading this, if someone finds these notes after I'm gone, know that I didn't go unwillingly. Know that when I joined the convoy for the final time, when I took my place in that formation and let the route carry me away, it was a choice. Maybe not a good choice, maybe not a smart choice, but mine nonetheless. And if you're a driver yourself, if you run these northern routes, pay attention to the CB chatter in the deep hours. Listen for a voice with a slight Montana accent, calling out mile markers and maintaining formation. That'll be me, running my loop, carrying my cargo, serving the route like all the others who came before. And if you ever see lights ahead on a dark highway, a convoy of trucks running in perfect formation, and a voice on the CB invites you to join up, think carefully before you answer. Because once you join, once you take your place in that line, there's no going back. The route becomes everything. The convoy becomes family. And the world you knew, the life you had, it all fades like a dream you can't quite remember. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe purpose is worth more than freedom. Maybe belonging is worth more than independence. Maybe the convoy understands something the rest of us spend our whole lives trying to avoid. That we're all heading to the same destination eventually, and there's comfort in traveling together, even if the route takes us places we never planned to go. 3 hours until I load out. 6 hours until I reach that stretch of Highway 19. 7 hours until 2:47 a.m., until the convoy appears, until I make my choice for the final time. I should be afraid, should be fighting this pull with everything I have. But all I feel is tired. Tired of resisting. Tired of being alone. Tired of pretending that escape was ever really possible. The CB just crackled with static, and underneath it, so faint I almost couldn't hear it, a voice. Her voice. That southern drawl I'd recognize anywhere. "See you soon, sugar. We've been waiting. Your spot in the formation is still open. Come on home." And I will. God help me, I will. Because the convoy is calling, and this time I'm ready to answer. This time I'm going to drive north and never look back. This time I'm going to take my place in that eternal procession and let the route carry me wherever it goes, for as long as it takes until I forget there was ever anything else. Until the road is all I am and all I need to be. The convoy runs forever, and soon I'll be running with it. Forever.